Hi friend, however you found your way here tonight, I am glad you did. Maybe the lights around you are already low. Maybe you are somewhere in the middle of making tea or still deciding if tonight is a tea kind of night at all. Take your time, there is no rush in this room. If you have spent an evening with me before, welcome back, it is good to have you here again. And if tonight happens to be your very first time settling in with me, welcome. You picked quite an evening to begin with, because tonight we're walking into a room most history books forget to mention. No doctor, no hospital bed, no monitor tracking heartbeat, just candlelight, the smell of boiled herbs in the air, and a circle of women who have done this more times than anyone ever bothered to count. For almost the whole of human history, this is how every single one of us arrived into the world. Before we step through that door together, let me ask you for something small. If evenings like this help your mind slow down even a little, then a like on this video costs you nothing and helps more than you might think. If you are new here, there is a small button that lets you stay, so the next story finds you when it is ready. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, which city, which country, which little corner of the world you're curled up in while you listen. I read every one of them, and it means something to know exactly who is sitting on the other side of this candlelight with me. Now go ahead. Turn the lights down as low as you can manage. Maybe switch on a fan or anything nearby that hums softly, just enough sound to keep the silence company. And when you are ready, let us step inside. The room is warmer than it should be for such a late hour because someone has kept the fire burning since midday, boiling water in a blackened pot until steam curls up toward the low ceiling, carrying with it the sharp green smell of crushed herbs. A single candle sits on a wooden table, its flame leaning slightly with every draught that slips beneath the door. Outside, the night is doing whatever the night does in this particular place, rain against a thatched roof, or wind moving through reeds along a riverbank, or simply the deep, close silence of a house far from any neighbour. Inside, none of that matters much. Shadows move slowly across the wall, cast by 3 women, sometimes 4, gathered around a low wooden stool. Its seat has a hollow cut into the centre, worn smooth by hips and hands that came long before this particular night. In the corner, an older woman kneels beside the younger one, wiping her forehead with the damp cloth, murmuring something too quiet to make out the kind of thing said only by someone who has stood in this exact spot before more than once and lived to tell about it. She is not panicking. Nobody in this room is panicking. There is a rhythm to what they are doing, unhurried and certain, the kind of calm that only comes from doing something difficult so many times it stops feeling difficult at all, even when it still is. There is no doctor here. There will not be one. The woman at the centre of the room is gripping the arm of someone she trusts completely, a sister, a mother, a neighbour. She has known her entire life, and she's not waiting for anyone else to walk through that door. Everything she needs is already here, carried inside the memory of the women surrounding her. Look closer, and you would notice the small collection laid out on a folded cloth near the fire. Dried raspberry leaves kept for exactly this night. A strip of willow bark chewed slow and bitter for the pain that has no other name yet. Clean linen boiled and boiled again, though nobody in that room could have explained why boiling mattered, only that their mother insisted on it, and her mother before that. A small sharp blade wiped clean and set aside for later, for the moment the cord would need cutting. None of it came from a shelf in a store. All of it came from a memory handed down like a family recipe nobody ever bothered to write on paper. This scene could belong to almost any place, almost any century. It could be a farmhouse in the cold, wet English countryside 300 years ago. It could be a mud brick home along the muddy banks of the Nile River 3,000 years before that, with a small clay figure of a hippopotamus goddess set carefully nearby standing guard over the doorway. It could be a cabin cut into the edge of a Maine forest snow piling quietly against the door. It could be a tiled courtyard in a Roman household, or a tent pitched somewhere on an open plain far from any town at all. Different walls, different languages, different names whispered toward different gods. But underneath all of it, the same task handled the same way by women, for women without a hospital anywhere in sight. And then somewhere in the middle of all that steam and candlelight and low steady voices there is a sound none of them were fully braced for, no matter how many times they had heard it before. A first cry, small, furious, and completely alive. For one moment every shoulder in that room drops at once, and something between a laugh and a sob passes between the women, the kind of sound that does not really have a name. If you are a mother yourself watching tonight, some part of this might already feel familiar to you, even if your own delivery room had bright lights and a beeping monitor instead of candles. The fear does not change much across the centuries, neither does the strength it takes to move through it anyway. And if you're not a mother, if you're simply someone's daughter or sister or friend, this is still in some quiet way your story too. Every family tree eventually leads back to a room exactly like this one. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. For nearly the entire span of human history, hospitals as we understand them today simply were not part of this picture. As recently as the early 1900s, the overwhelming majority of babies born here in America still arrived at home, not in a delivery room down a hospital hallway. Go back further and you find something even more remarkable. An entire body of medical knowledge built and maintained almost completely by women, covering everything from a girl's first monthly cycle to the arrival of her own children decades later, and almost none of it ever made it into the textbooks men would later use to claim they had invented modern medicine from scratch. It was not gentle work, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Historians who have spent years combing through old parish records, court papers, and family letters have pieced together a hard truth. In many periods before the 20th century, for every 8 or 9 women who spent their adult lives bearing children, one of them would eventually die because of it. Not because the women helping her were careless or unskilled, quite the opposite. These women could often read the position of an unborn baby with their hands, the way a doctor today reads an ultrasound screen, and if that baby was turned the wrong way, some knew how to carefully guide it. Working with their fingertips alone, no scalpel involved at all. They knew which herb slowed bleeding and which one in the wrong hands could kill just as fast as it could heal. They knew how long a labour was allowed to stretch before something was truly wrong, purely from having watched hundreds of labours before this one. They knew when patience was the answer, and when panic was the only sane response left. What they did not have was penicillin. They did not have blood waiting in a bag ready to replace what was lost. They were working quite literally by candlelight, armed with nothing but memory, courage, and each other. There was no birth plan printed neatly on cardstock, no playlist queued up on a phone resting on the nightstand, no lavender diffuser humming softly in the corner, just smoke, sweat, and usually someone's grandmother quietly telling everyone exactly what to do because she had buried enough mothers and babies over the years to know precisely which mistakes were not worth repeating. And somehow it worked often enough that here we all are. Every single person listening to my voice right now, every ancestor stretching back long before anyone thought to write history down at all, arrived into the world exactly this way. No hospital gave you that first breath, a woman did, usually more than one. That same invisible curriculum did not end the moment a child was born either. For thousands of years, women were also the ones quietly managing something almost nobody in power ever bothered to write about: the simple, monthly reality of their own bodies, using wool and linen and moss and whatever else could be found, developing an entire private language around a subject most men of the time preferred to pretend did not exist. We will get to that soon enough. So that is where we are headed over the time we spend together. Not a dry list of dates and clinical terms, but real rooms, real women, real choices made under real pressure. We will kneel beside that same hippopotamus goddess in ancient Egypt, the fiercest protector a mother in labour could hope to have beside her. We will sit in on 40 days of near-total seclusion that followed a birth in medieval Europe, a tradition shared in slightly different forms by Christian families, Jewish families and Muslim families alike, whether they realized how much they truly had in common or not. We will watch history quietly swap that worn wooden birthing stool for a flat bed, a change made mostly for the comfort of the man eventually standing over it and not for the woman lying in it. We will uncover a family secret so tightly guarded that it stayed hidden beneath a set of floorboards for more than 100 years, kept inside a huge gilded box that took 2 grown men just to carry at the cost of lives that almost certainly could have been saved along the way. We will read the actual diary of a woman on the edge of the American wilderness who delivered close to 1,000 babies with her own 2 hands and somehow managed to keep nearly every one of those mothers alive. We will meet the midwives of the American South, women whose skill and steadiness kept entire communities breathing long after anyone in power cared to notice, let alone thank them. We will learn how one doctor laughed out of his own profession for suggesting that other doctors simply wash their hands, turned out to be right the entire time, and paid a heavy price for being early. And we will sit with the strange, uncomfortable story of a so-called painless miracle promised to mothers in the early 1900s, one that left many of them screaming, restrained, and remembering absolutely nothing afterward. This is not really a story about how far we have come by leaving these women behind in the past. It is a story about how much we still owe them, whether we ever learn their names or not. Somewhere behind every convenience of modern motherhood, the clean sheets, the trained doctor, the medicine within reach. There is a much longer, much quieter history of women simply figuring it out night after night, for absolutely everyone who came after them, including you. But every long story needs a beginning, and ours starts in a place of sun, sand, and slow brown water, where the line between medicine and magic barely existed at all, and where a creature with the body of a hippopotamus, the paws of a lion and the tail of a crocodile was considered the single most trustworthy guardian a mother could ask to stand beside her. Her name was Taweret, and if you had asked an Egyptian mother more than 3,000 years ago who she trusted most in the entire universe during the hours before her child arrived, the answer would not have been a physician, and it would not have been a king. It would have been a monster. Picture the strangest, most contradictory creature you can imagine. The swollen body of a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright on 2 legs, the claws of a lion, the back and tail of a crocodile trailing behind her like something pulled out of a fever dream. Her mouth hangs open, tusks bared, an expression built entirely to frighten. And yet across the Nile Valley, women wore her likeness on cords around their necks, kept small clay versions of her on the household shelf, and called out to her the moment labour began. In Egypt, gentleness was not what stood between a mother and the dark. Ferocity was. If you ask me, there is something almost comforting in that idea. Not some delicate winged figure hovering politely out of reach, but a snarling, water-loving beast planting herself squarely between a labouring woman and whatever the night might try to send her way. The Egyptians were not naive people. They understood as well as anyone in the ancient world exactly how dangerous this moment truly was, and they built an entire spiritual defence system around the single night when a woman's body stood most exposed. Toweret rarely worked alone. Beside her stood Bez, a squat, bow-legged, wildly grinning little god, part dwarf and part lion, who danced and rattled and pulled faces so absurd that evil spirits supposedly fled the room out of sheer confusion. Households carved his image onto furniture legs, cosmetic jars, even the handles of everyday mirrors, not because anyone thought a piece of furniture needed protecting, but because a home filled with his grinning face everywhere you looked was in theory a home evil found deeply unwelcoming. There was Hathor, gentle and cow-horned, watching over the domestic warmth of the household. There was Mesquine, imagined not as a person at all, but as a birth brick given a human face, because in Egypt even the object beneath a labouring woman's feet was considered sacred enough to become a goddess in its own right. That detail is worth slowing down on because it is not myth, it is archaeology. In the early 2000s, a team excavating a site called South Abydos uncovered an actual birth brick painted dating back to the Middle Kingdom, roughly the 12th dynasty of Egypt. It shows a mother holding her newborn flanked by protective figures, decorated the way you might decorate a nursery today, except carved directly into the very brick a woman would have knelt or squatted on while she pushed. Two such bricks set on the ground with a gap between them form the entire delivery surface for an ordinary Egyptian birth. No table, no bed, just earth, clay, and the weight of a woman's own body doing the work gravity always intended it to do. Now hold that picture for a second and set it beside something you may have seen before without ever realizing what it truly was. Carved into the wall of a temple at a place called Esne, there is a relief showing Cleopatra herself, giving birth, not lying flat on her back the way film and television almost always show it, but kneeling upright, supported on either side by attendants. It is one of the few clear images we have of an actual queen in the act of labour, and it lines up perfectly with everything else archaeology tells us about how Egyptian women delivered their children. Upright, grounded, working with the pull of the earth instead of against it. Would that surprise you if you pictured Cleopatra at all before tonight, lying elegantly across silk pillows the way the movies love to imagine her? History as usual had other plans. Here is a question worth sitting with while the fire crackles wherever you happen to be listening tonight. If squatting and kneeling positions used gravity so effectively that they show up again and again across ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and dozens of other cultures we will visit before this journey is over, why did so much of the modern world eventually decide that flat on your back was the correct way to give birth? Keep that question in your pocket. We're going to return to it later, and the answer is not nearly as medical as you might expect. Egyptian medicine, if we can even call it that, lived in a strange and fascinating space between prayer and observation. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts on Earth, sits somewhere in that space perfectly. Alongside genuine anatomical descriptions, it contains incantations meant to be spoken over a labouring woman, poetic little chants asking the gods to hold the door open gently. But buried inside that same scroll is something that still catches modern researchers off guard. A method for testing pregnancy using nothing more than a woman's urine poured over sacks of barley and emmer wheat seeds. According to the papyrus, if the barley sprouted first, the child would be a boy. If the wheat sprouted first, a girl. If neither sprouted at all, there was no pregnancy. It sounds on the surface like pure superstition, the kind of thing we might smile politely at and move past. Except in the 1960s, a team of researchers actually tested this exact method in a laboratory using real human urine samples. The results were strange enough to make anyone pause. Urine from pregnant women caused the seeds to sprout at a noticeably higher rate, then urine from women who were not pregnant almost certainly because of the elevated hormone levels involved. The gender prediction turned out to be no better than a coin flip, so let us not give the Egyptians too much credit there. But the basic pregnancy test itself worked far more often than pure chance should have allowed. 3,000 years before anyone had heard the word hormone, someone in Egypt had already noticed that a pregnant woman's body changed something invisible in her urine and had built an entire test around that observation. Say what you want about the gods and the incantations, somebody in that culture was paying very close attention. Now let us cross the water away from the Nile and its incantations into a very different corner of the ancient world, one that liked to believe it had left superstition behind entirely, even though it had not really. In the 2nd century in the Greek city of Ephesus, a physician named Soranus sat down and wrote what may be the single most important document in the entire ancient history of childbirth, a detailed manual titled in translation something close to On Midwifery and the Diseases of Women. And what makes Soranus remarkable is not simply that he wrote it, it is what he chose to say inside it. It is worth pausing here to notice who Soranus was actually writing for. The women doing this work across the Roman world known as the obstetrics were rarely wealthy and rarely powerful. Many had once been enslaved, later freed, and had built a respected trade for themselves through nothing but apprenticeship and repetition, one birth teaching them what the last one had not. Rome, for all its talk of order and law, quietly depended on these women completely, and a handful of the best among them became wealthy and well known in their own right, occasionally even commemorated on gravestones that proudly listed their profession. Soranus was not writing down brand new information, so much as he was carefully collecting and organizing knowledge that skilled women already carried in their hands and giving it for the first time the dignity of ink and parchment. Soranus told midwives quite plainly not to rush. He warned against unnecessary intervention, against pulling or forcing or panicking the moment labor slowed down. He described in careful detail a technique now called pedalic version, a method of gently reaching in and turning a baby positioned wrong feet first, instead of head first guiding it into a safer position, using nothing but trained hands and patience. He wrote prenatal advice covering diet and gentle exercise. He even addressed family planning, offering guidance on managing the timing and spacing of pregnancies, a subject most physicians of his era would not touch with a 10-foot pole. And running underneath almost every page is one consistent idea repeated again and again in different forms. Trust the body. Do not fight it. Your hands are a tool, not a weapon. Picture for a moment a Roman household on an ordinary evening, oil lamps burning low along the wall instead of candles, because candles as we picture them today barely existed yet in this part of the world. A midwife trained in the Soranus tradition kneels beside a low wooden birthing chair, its seat cut with an opening much like the Egyptian bricks 1,000 miles away, though neither culture likely knew the other had thought of it first. The baby is turned wrong feet down instead of head down, and in a Roman household with a less careful attendant, this might have ended in tragedy, forceps or hooks or desperate pulling. Instead, this midwife works slowly, feeling with her fingertips, easing the small body around from the outside, murmuring instructions to the mother, the entire time steady and unhurried, exactly the way a manual written 100 years earlier had described. It is not magic. It is technique learned, practiced, and passed down teacher to student for generations. Once the child had actually arrived, the Roman household did not simply return to normal the next morning. For roughly 8 or 9 days, mother and newborn were considered to be in a kind of suspended state, not sick exactly, but not fully returned to ordinary life either. On what the Romans called the Day of Purification, the household finally performed a formal cleansing ritual, and gave the child its name, treating both events as connected halves of the same idea that a new life needed to be washed clean of the danger surrounding its arrival before it could properly join the world of the living. The Greeks held a similar instinct, describing a defined stretch of days following delivery during which a mother was expected to rest and heal from what her body had just been through, guided by the same medical thinking that shaped Hippocratic writings on the human body more broadly. Neither culture fully understood infection in the way we do today, but both independently landed on roughly the same conclusion that the days right after birth were fragile, dangerous, and deserved to be treated with real caution rather than rushed past. What strikes me most about Soranus, honestly, is how openly he pushed back against the popular superstitions of his own time. This was a man living in a deeply religious world surrounded by charms and curses and household gods, just like the Egyptians before him, and yet he specifically criticized midwives who relied on amulets and magical formulas instead of actual observation and skill. He was not against belief. He simply insisted that belief was not enough on its own to save a life. In a strange way, an ancient Greek physician was arguing for something we now call evidence-based practice nearly 2,000 years before anyone gave it that name. So here is the honest, complicated picture forming across these two ancient worlds. In Egypt, spirituality and medicine were almost entirely fused together. A birth brick was both a physical tool and a goddess at the same time, and nobody saw any contradiction in that. In Greece and Rome, at least among the more serious physicians, there was a slow, deliberate push towards separating superstition from skill, toward writing things down, testing them, refining them. Neither approach had access to antibiotics. Neither approach could stop a serious hemorrhage. But both in their own very different ways understood something essential that took much of the modern medical world centuries to rediscover, that childbirth generally goes better when it is not rushed, not forced, and not treated as an emergency the moment it simply becomes difficult. It would be dishonest, though, to paint this world as gentler than our own in every way. For every birth eased by a skilled pair of hands, there were countless others lost to infection, to bleeding no amount of patience could stop, to a baby positioned in a way no amount of skill could correct without tools nobody had yet invented. Historians studying burial sites from this era have found something quietly devastating. Infant remains, and young mothers buried together with unusual frequency, a pattern repeated across ancient cemeteries from Egypt to Italy. Interestingly, some of the wealthiest tombs show no better odds than the humblest ones. Gold jewellery and imported linen could not turn a breech baby around, and a queen's physicians, for all their training, faced the same basic biology as the woman kneeling on 2 mud bricks in a farming village along the river. Belief in Tauret did not make her invincible. A well-written manual from Soranus did not guarantee a safe delivery. What both cultures had in the end was not certainty. It was practice accumulated slowly generation after generation, alongside an honest acceptance that some nights simply would not end well, no matter how carefully anyone prepared. And maybe that is the real thread connecting a hippopotamus goddess on the Nile to a Greek physician writing careful notes in Ephesus. Neither one promised safety. What they offered instead was present skill, and the refusal to leave a woman to face that night completely alone. There is another thread running quietly beneath everything we've covered so far tonight, one neither the Egyptians nor the Romans wrote about with much comfort or clarity, even though every single woman in every story we have just told experienced it herself, month after month for most of her adult life. It rarely appears in temple carvings. It barely survives in medical scrolls. And when ancient physicians did attempt to explain it, they got the science wrong in ways that would go on to shape how the entire Western world treated women's bodies for almost 2,000 years afterward. That story is next, and it begins with a piece of wool, a length of soft papyrus, and a secret so ordinary that almost nobody in power ever bothered writing it down at all. Every month for most of her adult life, an ordinary woman along the Nile folded a strip of soft papyrus or a scrap of clean linen, tucked it into place, and went about her day exactly as she always had. No temple wall shows a ceremony built around it. No surviving decree regulates it. Egyptian medical writings barely pause on the subject at all, treating it as neither a curse nor a crisis, simply one more ordinary function of a body that occasionally needed tending, the same way a person might tend a cut finger or a sore back. There is even a surviving scroll older than almost anything else we've looked at tonight, sometimes called the gynecological papyrus, that reads less like scripture and more like an actual working medical reference. It lists remedies for irregular bleeding methods, for easing, cramping, and observations about fertility written in the same practical tone a modern nurse might use flipping through a patient chart. Whoever compiled it clearly believed this subject deserved careful, sober attention rather than shame. Considering what was about to happen just across the water, that near silence paired with genuine clinical curiosity might be the most respectful reaction anybody managed on this subject for the next 2,000 years. Because in Greece, physicians were about to build an entire medical theory around this ordinary monthly event, and it was going to be spectacularly, confidently and catastrophically wrong. The physician credited as the father of Western medicine, working in the 5th century before the modern calendar even existed, wrote that lint wrapped tightly around a small piece of wood could be used the way we might use a tampon today, a plainly practical, sensible observation. But sitting right alongside that useful detail was an idea far less useful and far more dangerous in the long run. The belief that a woman's womb was not fixed in place at all, but capable of wandering through her body like some restless, dissatisfied creature, drifting upward toward the throat or the chest whenever it went too long, without what physicians of the time delicately called proper moisture. And what kept that wandering under control, according to this theory, was regular menstrual bleeding. Block it, delay it, or interrupt it, and the womb supposedly went looking for trouble elsewhere in the body, dragging a woman's mood and sanity along with it. Have you ever heard the word hysteria used to describe a woman losing her composure and never once stopped to ask where that word actually came from? Sit with that question for a moment, because we are about to walk directly into the answer. This was not some fringe idea either, whispered only by minor physicians in back-alley clinics. One of the most celebrated philosophers in Athenian history took the theory seriously enough to write it directly into one of his major works, describing the womb almost as a living creature in its own right, restless and unhappy whenever it went too long without fulfilling what he considered its natural purpose, capable, in his words, of wandering through the body and blocking the passages of breath itself. When an idea gets endorsed by both the leading medical mind and the leading philosophical mind of an entire civilization, it tends to stop being treated as speculation and starts being treated as settled fact, however wrong it happens to be. That word traces back to the Greek term for womb. For centuries afterward, doctors across Europe used hysteria as a genuine medical diagnosis, one applied almost exclusively to women, and the treatment prescribed for it frequently circled back to the exact same ancient idea that something needed to move drain or release properly inside a woman's body before her mind could be trusted to behave itself. An ordinary biological process poorly understood by men who had never experienced it, and rarely bothered asking the women who had somehow become the medical explanation for centuries of female behaviour that made powerful men uncomfortable. I find that both fascinating and frankly a little infuriating, and I suspect I am not alone in that reaction. Rome absorbed a version of this thinking, though the Romans, ever practical about physical comfort, even while getting the underlying science wrong, focused more on management than theory. Wealthier women used pads cut from wool, soft and reasonably absorbent, sometimes explicitly reserved and tailored for the purpose. Poorer women made do with whatever fabric scraps a household could spare, cut from worn-out garments, too damaged for anything else. Roman scholarship, meanwhile, took the superstition running underneath all of this and turned it up to a truly remarkable volume. One widely read Roman author better known today for cataloguing everything from volcanoes to elephants, in an enormous encyclopedia of the natural world, seriously claimed that a menstruating woman could dull the edge of a blade simply by walking near it. Sour fresh wine in its barrel, wilt entire fields of crops, and in one particularly dramatic passage, calm a raging storm at sea if she simply stepped outside during it. It reads almost like satire today, and I have to admit, reading it now, it is hard not to laugh a little. But people took it seriously enough at the time to repeat it for centuries, which tells you something rather important about how far an ordinary bodily function can drift from plain biology once frightened men start writing books about it. I sometimes wonder what that same author would have made of a simple, honest conversation about biology instead. Probably nothing quite so entertaining to write down, but a great deal less nonsense for everyone else to untangle 2,000 years later. Some accounts describe something close to what modern writers have called period tense, spaces where menstruating women were expected to withdraw for a stretch of days, echoing a pattern that shows up again and again across cultures, scattered around the entire ancient world, from certain communities in ancient India to indigenous groups across parts of North America centuries later, each arriving at strikingly similar customs of temporary seclusion, almost entirely independent of one another. Something about this particular biological reality seems to have nudged an extraordinary range of human societies toward the exact same instinct separate the woman from ordinary life for a few days, whether out of genuine reverence, discomfort, superstition, or quite often some tangled combination of all three at once. There is a particular story worth telling here, though. I want to be careful with it because history rarely hands us anything perfectly clean. Centuries after the height of Rome, a Byzantine encyclopedia compiled around the 10th century preserved an old account concerning Hypatia, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher who taught in Alexandria around the turn of the 5th century, a woman respected enough in her own lifetime that students travelled considerable distances just to sit in her lectures. According to that later record, when a persistent student pressed his romantic attention on her, far past the point of comfort, she is said to have produced a used menstrual cloth and thrown it directly at him, informing him in effect that this was the reality behind the idealized woman he claimed to desire. The anecdote was written down long after Hypatia had died by someone who almost certainly never met her, which means historians treat the precise details with healthy caution, but true or embellished, the story survived being copied by hand across hundreds of years for a reason. It captured something people clearly wanted, remembered a brilliant woman refusing to let her body be treated as shameful currency in someone else's fantasy, using the very thing culture had taught her to hide as the sharpest possible answer to a man who would not take no for a simple answer. Meanwhile, an entirely different set of rules was taking shape within Jewish religious law. The Book of Leviticus lays out specific guidance describing a woman during her monthly cycle as ritually impure for a period of 7 days, restricting particular kinds of physical contact during that window. Rabbinic tradition developed this into an entire structured practice, still observed by many families today, referred to using a Hebrew term that translates roughly to the one who is set apart, involving a period of separation followed by a ritual bath marking the return to ordinary domestic life. Some later commentators framed the practice as a burden placed on women. Others, including a number of women who follow it today, describe it instead as a built-in rhythm of privacy and rest, a monthly pause written directly into the structure of family life rather than left to chance. It is worth noting clearly, since it is easy to blur together, that this is a distinctly different tradition from the extended weeks of recovery following an actual birth that we touched on earlier tonight, a separate custom entirely tied specifically to the ordinary monthly cycle rather than the arrival of a child. Whatever a modern reader makes of purity laws written thousands of years ago, they reveal something worth noticing: an entire structured religious and social system built quite deliberately around this one recurring biological reality, taken seriously enough to shape law architecture, even the rhythm of a household's week. Islamic tradition, developing centuries later, arrived at a related but distinct approach. Scripture and prophetic teaching excused a menstruating woman from the obligation of daily prayer and the fast observed during the holy month, treating the exemption not as a punishment but as an acknowledgement of genuine physical difficulty, a recognition built directly into religious law rather than left to private discretion. Scholars across different regions and centuries debated the finer details endlessly. How many days counted as typical? What counted as the end of a cycle? But the underlying premise stayed remarkably consistent, that this was a real bodily state deserving formal accommodation, not something a woman needed to quietly push through and pretend was not happening. Three major religious traditions, developing largely apart from one another, across different centuries and different corners of the world, all eventually arrived at the same basic instinct structure name and formally acknowledge what so much of the surrounding culture preferred to treat as unspeakable. Push forward into medieval England, and the practical side of the story looks almost startlingly familiar despite the centuries in between. Women there made use of something local herbalists called blood moss, an unusually absorbent variety of peat found in wetland bogs across the region, the very same material soldiers packed into wounds on distant battlefields because of how efficiently it soaked up blood. Rabbit fur shows up in some household accounts too, along with soft sponges harvested from the sea wherever coastal trade made them available, though for most ordinary women none of that mattered nearly as much as plain cloth. Worn, washed, dried, and worn again, it remained the standard, a private, repetitive chore folded quietly into the rhythm of an entire household's laundry, without ever once being mentioned directly in polite conversation. That quiet, practical habit is very likely where an old expression still lingering in casual English actually comes from. The phrase about being on the rag born not from cruelty exactly, but from an entire culture's stubborn refusal to simply say the plain word for what was happening. And yet, even inside a culture built almost entirely around discretion, there were occasional cracks in the silence, small and unexpected. A well-known English diarist writing in the 1660s, a man who recorded his daily life in remarkable and occasionally uncomfortable detail, mentioned his wife's monthly cycle in his private journal, more than once discussing it with the same plain, unbothered tone he used for weather or dinner. His writing suggests that inside the privacy of an ordinary 17th century marriage, at least some couples spoke about this subject with far more ease than the wider culture around them ever openly admitted to. It is worth pointing out, though, that we know this only because a man happened to write it down. Women of that same century kept diaries too, but far fewer survived, and the ones that did rarely touch this particular subject at all, likely because the women writing them had absorbed exactly the same instinct for silence everyone around them practiced. Public silence and private conversation, it turns out, are not always the same thing then, or frankly now, but history mostly only overhears the half of that conversation that men were willing to write down. Here is what I keep circling back to, turning this whole story over in my mind. A theory built on nothing but guesswork, dreamed up by physicians and philosophers who never once experienced the thing they were theorizing about, managed to survive for well over 2,000 years, quietly shaping how doctors, husbands, judges, and entire societies understood women's minds, their moods, their supposed fitness to be trusted with responsibility. That ancient idea about a wandering, dissatisfied womb did not simply fade away with the fall of Greece and Rome. Under new names and slightly updated language, it kept resurfacing all the way into the formal medical textbooks of the 18 and 1900s, where hysteria remained a recognized diagnosis handed to women for symptoms as ordinary as fatigue, irritability, or simply speaking out of turn. It would eventually collide quite dramatically with the strict buttoned-up medicine of a much later century, one we're going to spend real time with before this night is through. But silence, as it turns out, was never reserved only for a woman's monthly cycle. That same instinct to withdraw, to seclude, to quietly wait out a private ordeal behind a closed door followed a woman into an entirely different chapter of her life, as well, one that arrived only once or twice a decade rather than once a month, and came wrapped in a set of rules, so specific, so carefully staged across different faiths and different corners of Europe, that it deserves a room of its own, with its own fire, its own visitors, and its own strange etiquette, for exactly when a new mother was considered ready to rejoin the world outside her front door. That room comes next, and this time the door stays closed for 40 days. Try for a moment agreeing to something like this yourself. 40 days inside one single room. No open window unless someone else decides to allow it. No fresh air, no errands, no stepping outside for so much as a breath, regardless of how well you actually feel 2 days in, or 5 or 20. Meals arrive on a tray. Conversation arrives only when someone chooses to bring it to you. The rest of the world simply keeps moving somewhere beyond that closed door, weddings, market days, entire seasons, changing outside a window you're not permitted to open. For a very long stretch of European history, this was not punishment. This was considered care, and a new mother was expected to be grateful for it. The custom is generally called lying in, and it stretched, depending on the century and the family's wealth, anywhere from roughly 2 weeks to a full 2 months. Wealthier households prepared for it the way you might prepare for a small indoor season. The chamber was kept deliberately dim, heavy curtains drawn across the windows, sometimes tapestries hung over bare stone walls specifically to trap warmth and block drafts, because cold air was widely believed to be seriously dangerous to a body still recovering from birth. A fire stayed lit around the clock. Fresh air, so prized by later generations of doctors, was treated here as something closer to a threat than a comfort. Families who could afford it hired a role entirely separate from the midwife, who had actually delivered the child, a woman known as the monthly nurse. Her job began only after the birth itself was finished, moving into the household for the full stretch of confinement to manage everything from feeding schedules to laundry to keeping visitors properly organized, essentially running the domestic side of an operation. The mother herself was by custom no longer permitted to touch. She fed the fire, boiled the linens, mixed the possets, and broths considered strengthening for a recovering body, and quietly decided which visitors were welcome on any given afternoon, and which ones needed turning away at the door. A skilled monthly nurse could become something close to a fixture in wealthy circles, quietly building a reputation and a client list the way a respected physician might years before women were formally allowed to train as either. And this next part happens to be one of my favourite pieces of hidden history buried anywhere in this entire subject, so let me walk you through it properly. During confinement, a mother was almost never left alone with only the monthly nurse for company. She was surrounded instead by a close circle of female friends and relatives who came to sit with her, keep her spirits up and help pass the long closed-in days. In Old English, these companions carried a specific title, one built from the word for kin combined with the word for God, essentially meaning something close to a person related to you through God, the same root that eventually gave us the word godparent. Over the following centuries, that title slowly narrowed and shifted, applied more and more specifically to exactly this group of women gathered in a dim, warm room together for weeks at a time, with remarkably little else to do besides talk. Here is the part I love. Talk is precisely what they did. Confined together for days on end, sharing news, trading opinions about the neighbours, discussing who was courting, whom, and whose husband had been seen, where he probably should not have been, this circle of women, the god-sibs, gradually lent their entire name to the very activity that defined their gatherings. That original word, worn down and reshaped by centuries of ordinary speech, is the exact same word we still use today, completely unaware of where it came from whenever we accuse somebody of gossiping. Every single time you hear that word now, you are hearing a faint, distant echo of women locked away together in a childbed chamber, doing the one thing left available to them, talking, and apparently doing it well enough that the habit outlived the room itself by roughly 1,000 years. The visits themselves came with their own small ceremony. Guests arriving to see the confined mother traditionally brought cake and a warm spiced drink called caudle, thickened with eggs, or oatmeal sweetened and passed from cup to cup among the gathered women almost like a toast. It became such a fixture of these visits that taking caudle turned into a polite shorthand for the entire social custom, an early cosy cousin of the modern baby shower, except staged entirely inside the new mother's own bedroom, because she was the only one who legally, or at least customarily, was not allowed to go anywhere else. Does it feel strange to you that a word we still use constantly, almost carelessly in ordinary conversation, carries a birthing room folded quietly inside it? It certainly does to me, and I doubt I will hear it quite the same way again. So the next time someone teases you for gossiping a little too much over coffee, you now have a fairly solid comeback ready. You are not wasting time. You are participating in one of the oldest continuously practiced traditions among women in the entire history of the English language. Confinement finally ended with a specific religious ceremony known as the churching of women, and to understand where that ceremony came from, it helps to return briefly to a text we've already spent some time with tonight. The same ancient book that laid out rules around a woman's monthly cycle also contains an entirely separate set of instructions concerning childbirth specifically. And this time the details get uncomfortable rather quickly. According to that text, a mother who delivered a boy was considered ritually unclean for 40 days. A mother who delivered a girl was given exactly double that 80 days. Medieval Christian tradition inherited this framework more or less intact, and by around the 11th century had built an entire formal rite around the ending of it, a church service specifically designed to welcome the mother back into public religious life, complete with a special seat near the door, a blessing, and in many parishes, an offering of candles she was expected to bring along with her. Only after that service could she resume her ordinary place among the congregation, walk freely through the market, or return to the everyday routines of her household without comment. I will be honest with you, sitting with that number difference for a moment, 40 days against 80, still catches me somewhere uncomfortable even now. Whatever explanation theologians have offered across the centuries, it is difficult not to notice that even the act of simply having given birth to a daughter was treated quite literally as requiring twice the ritual cleansing. Christian households were far from alone in building elaborate protection around this particular stretch of time, and stepping just across a cultural border reveals something worth sitting with. In parts of medieval Spain, where Christian, Jewish and Muslim communities lived within close reach of one another, each tradition developed its own detailed, almost cinematic set of protective customs, all aimed squarely at the same underlying fear that the days immediately following birth were dangerous not just physically but spiritually. Jewish households in this period sometimes drew an actual circle around the birthing bed itself, chalked or traced directly onto the floor, and wrote specific protective words along the walls and door of the room, invoking a set of guardian names alongside a direct warning aimed at a figure named Lilith, a night demon believed in certain strands of folklore to threaten newborn children, specifically said to slip into houses after dark searching for exactly this kind of vulnerable, unguarded moment. Amulets bearing the same protective names were sometimes hung directly above the cradle as a second physical layer of defense in case the chalk alone was not quite enough, until the newborn boy's ritual circumcision traditionally held on the 8th day. Neither mother nor child was expected to leave the house at all, the family instead waiting quietly inside while the rest of the world continued on without them. Muslim households nearby developed their own careful sequence. Midwives cleaned a newborn's mouth with cotton dipped in a specially prepared solution, sometimes softened dates, then wrapped the child in plain white linen, after which the highest-ranking male member of the household would lean close and quietly speak the declaration of faith directly into the infant's ear, welcoming it into the religious community within moments of its arrival, long before it had even opened its eyes to the room around it. Salt was scattered around the birthing room specifically to ward off the evil eye, a belief in unintentional harm caused by envious glances that shows up in one form or another in cultures scattered across an enormous stretch of the ancient and medieval world, from the Mediterranean coast to well beyond it. For 3 full days afterward, nobody in the household was permitted to walk between the sleeping infant and the lit hearth fire, a small, oddly specific rule that nonetheless reveals just how seriously that early window of vulnerability was treated. 3 separate faiths sharing the same stretch of land, and often the same marketplace, developed customs that looked strikingly different on the surface, and yet all pointed toward the identical underlying instinct. Something dangerous still lingers in the days right after birth. Danger nobody could fully explain using the medical knowledge available at the time, so ritual filled in wherever plain observation ran out. Chalk circles whispered prayers, scattered salt, a church bell, all different languages describing the exact same fear. And honestly, when you line them up side by side like this, the similarities start to feel far louder than the differences ever do. And here is where I think it is worth being completely honest with you, because the ritual, however beautiful or strange it might sound from a modern chair, was not actually protecting anybody from the real dangers waiting in that room. Hemorrhage remained the single deadliest complication a woman could face, and no amount of salt or chalk could slow bleeding that would not stop on its own. Fever crept in too silently, sometimes days after everyone had already relaxed and assumed the danger had passed. Labour that stalled too long against an awkwardly positioned baby could tear tissue in ways that never properly healed, leaving a woman with a permanent physically devastating injury, known as a fistula, a condition rarely discussed at the time and treated when it was mentioned at all as a private shame rather than a medical injury deserving real treatment. Women who survived difficult or repeated deliveries frequently lived out the remainder of their lives with chronic pelvic damage, sometimes severe enough to affect basic daily movement conditions, Almost nobody wrote down plainly because almost nobody considered a woman's ongoing physical suffering once the baby had safely arrived particularly worth recording. It is also worth noticing who actually received this elaborate 40-day retreat in the first place. A noblewoman or a merchant's wife might truly withdraw from public view for weeks beforehand, as well as afterward resting in a properly prepared chamber the entire time, attended by servants whose entire job existed to make that stillness possible. A farmer's wife, a labourer's wife, a servant rarely had that luxury available to her at all. Plenty of working women were back tending animals, hauling water, or standing over a washtub within days of delivering confinement, quietly becoming in practice one more privilege reserved almost entirely for those who could afford somebody else to do the work in their place. The ritual calendar might have insisted every mother deserved 40 days of rest, but the household ledger, as it so often does, told a rather different and considerably less generous story. So confinement, looked at honestly, was never simply one thing. For an exhausted body that had just survived one of the most physically demanding events a human being can experience, weeks of enforced rest, warmth and support probably did genuine good, whatever the surrounding superstition looked like from the outside. But that same closed door could just as easily become a form of control, deciding exactly when a woman was permitted to re-enter her own life, who got to visit her, and whose name got quietly discussed, while she had absolutely no say in any of it. Care and control offered by the very same closed door at the very same time, by the very same well-meaning household. Rest and restriction. It turns out can share the exact same room without much difficulty at all. Nobody at the time had a name for what some of these women likely felt during those long closed-in weeks, the exhaustion tangled together with something heavier, a low persistent sadness that modern medicine now understands and treats seriously, but which a medieval household would simply have called low spirits, or perhaps not mentioned at all. Surrounded by well-meaning gossips and cake and warm-spiced drink, a woman could still be desperately lonely, frightened by how she felt and completely without language to explain any of it to anyone in the room. That particular silence, unlike the ritual and the ceremony surrounding it, has taken remarkably longer for the world to properly address. There was, however, one detail buried in nearly every single tradition we just walked through that I deliberately left sitting quietly in the background waiting for the right moment. Did you notice it? In Egypt, women knelt upright on bricks. In Rome, they used a low chair with an opening cut straight through the seat. And now, across an entire continent of confinement chambers, chalk circles and midnight prayers against demons, almost nobody, we have discussed tonight, gave birth lying flat on their back at all. Whatever room you pictured, whatever century, whatever faith, the woman at the centre of it was almost always upright gravity working with her rather than against her. That detail was still waiting somewhere ahead of us, quietly holding steady across thousands of years and dozens of cultures that otherwise agreed on almost nothing else. And the story behind exactly how and why an entire civilization eventually decided the opposite direction was correct turns out to be far less medical and considerably more political than you might expect. The story behind why so many women eventually ended up flat on their backs during labour starts of all places with a king who simply liked to watch a French surgeon with a rather unflattering opinion of pregnancy, and a piece of medical folklore that has been repeated so many times it has practically become fact by sheer force of habit. So let us pull it apart properly piece by piece and see what actually holds up. For roughly as long as anyone has left evidence of childbirth at all, upright postures dominated. Kneeling, squatting, sitting on a low stool with a hollow cut through the seat, sometimes simply standing supported by two attendants on either side, arms braced against their shoulders, while gravity did a fair share of the actual work. We have already walked through several versions of this tonight. Different centuries, different continents, different gods watching over the room, yet almost every single one of them shared this same basic physical logic. Let gravity help carry the weight downward instead of fighting against it. Nobody needed a medical degree to notice that this simply worked better. Grandmothers noticed it. Midwives noticed it. It was common sense passed down through observation long before anyone thought to measure it in a laboratory. Archaeologists have even traced the birthing stool itself back to ancient Babylon. Carved stone and wooden versions dating back roughly 4,000 years, centuries before the painted bricks we discussed from Egypt, which tells you this was never some fringe regional habit. It was close to a universal human default. That began changing slowly at first, somewhere around the middle of the 1500s. A new class of practitioner started showing up around European birthing rooms, men trained as barber surgeons originally hired for cutting hair and pulling teeth, now competing directly with midwives for a share of one of the only medical events guaranteed to happen in nearly every household eventually. These men rarely had much genuine obstetric experience, learning largely on the job, and more than a few historians studying this period have noted that their arrival did not immediately make anything safer, only more expensive and considerably more male. One of the more influential figures to emerge from this world, a French surgeon widely credited as a founder of modern surgical practice, trained a student named Jacques Guillemot, who in the final years of the 1500s argued openly in favour of reclining birth. His reasoning was refreshingly honest, even if the honesty was entirely self-interested. A woman lying down, he explained, made it considerably easier for a surgeon standing over her to actually see and reach what he was doing. Can you already feel where this is heading? A decision framed as medical progress built quietly on top of a decision about who could see best and who could work most comfortably, rather than what actually served the woman doing the labour. That thread of thinking found its fullest expression roughly 70 years later in the work of a French physician named François Morisot, whose 1668 treatise on the diseases of pregnant women became one of the most widely read medical texts of its century, translated and studied across much of Europe. Morisot's attitude toward pregnancy itself is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about the era's underlying philosophy. He described a growing pregnant belly using language borrowed straight from disease, comparing it quite directly to a tumour. Childbirth, in his framework, stopped being an ordinary if difficult part of a woman's life and became something closer to a medical emergency waiting to happen, a condition requiring intervention rather than simply support. And once you decide that birth is fundamentally a medical procedure rather than a natural process, the next logical step follows almost automatically. Put the patient in the position that best serves the procedure. Morisot argued plainly for horizontal birth specifically, so the mother would not need to be moved into a bed immediately afterward, a small practical justification that ended up reshaping an experience shared by literally every single human being who has ever been born. Picture for a moment an ordinary household adopting this new fashion, second-hand a merchant's wife somewhere outside Paris, her family eager to appear modern and properly attended. The old birthing stool, the very one her own mother had used, sits pushed into a corner, suddenly considered old-fashioned, almost embarrassing. In its place, a bed has been specially arranged, pillows stacked to prop her at an angle, a surgeon standing rather than kneeling. His instruments laid out on a cloth beside him, the way a craftsman might lay out his tools before starting a difficult repair. Nobody in that room stopped to ask whether the new arrangement actually helped her. It looked correct. It looked current. Sometimes, unfortunately, that alone is enough to change 3 centuries of practice. I find myself thinking honestly that this particular impulse never really left us. Even now, medical fashion occasionally moves faster than medical evidence, a new device, or a new protocol adopted because it looks modern and capable, long before anyone has fully proven it works better than what came before. The 17th century did not invent that mistake. It simply happened to make it inside a birthing room, at a moment when almost nobody in a position of authority was inclined to ask the woman on the bed what she actually preferred. Now here is where the story usually gets a little more theatrical, and I want to walk you through it honestly because the popular version and the historical record do not entirely agree with each other, and I think that disagreement is actually the more interesting story. You may have already heard some version of this next part. King Louis XIV of France, ruler for an astonishing 72 years, fathered a remarkable number of children across both his marriages and his various mistresses, and according to a persistent and widely repeated account, took a personal enthusiastic interest in watching those births happen. Standing behind a screen or so, several later writers claim the king found the traditional birthing stool frustratingly obstructive. To his view, the wooden frame and the attendants clustered around it, blocking exactly the angle he most wanted to see. According to the legend, he reportedly encouraged, or in some tellings outright insisted, that the women deliver lying flat. Instead, allegedly even preferring male attendants over midwives for the job men. He could instruct directly men who would arrange the room the way he wanted it arranged. Because royal habits had a way of trickling downward through society at the time, the story goes the entire French aristocracy, and eventually much of Europe, gradually adopted the same position, all tracing back to one king's rather unusual preference for a better vantage point. Courtiers reportedly ordering their own household beds rearranged to match purely to seem fashionably in step with the palace. It is a wonderfully vivid story, and I completely understand why it has survived this long. It has a villain, a punchline, and a satisfying sense of scandal wrapped around an otherwise dry medical shift. But when historians who study this period specifically have gone looking for solid documentation, tying the king directly to any formal policy or decree on the matter, the trail gets considerably thinner than the story suggests. There is no royal edict sitting in an archive somewhere ordering French midwives to abandon their stools. What we can say with real confidence is that Louis did take a personal interest in his family's births, that contemporary writers did note his curiosity, and that the reclining position was absolutely becoming more common in exactly this period, in exactly this country, driven largely by the surgeons and physicians we have already discussed. What remains far less certain is whether one king's private curiosity actually redirected an entire continent's medical practice on its own, or whether later writers centuries removed from the actual events simply found his story a far more entertaining explanation than the truth, which was slower, less scandalous, and had already been building for decades through surgeons like Guillemot and physicians like Morisot, one dry medical treatise at a time. I tend to think the truth usually loses the popularity contest against a good scandal, and this looks like exactly that kind of contest. A genuine historical shift wearing a much juicier legend as its public face. Whichever version of that story you find more convincing, the actual medical consequences are not up for debate at all, because those we can measure directly. Lying flat on the back significantly narrows the space available in the pelvis, reducing it by a meaningful margin. Compared with an upright position, work modern researchers have confirmed using far more precise tools than any 17th century surgeon had available. A narrower opening tends to mean a longer labour, increased pain. and a considerably higher likelihood that a tired, frustrated attendant eventually reaches for some kind of tool to finish the job the body was actually built to do on its own, given the position and the patience to do it. Gravity quite simply stopped being an ally, and started being something the mother's body had to work against for hours at a time, purely so the person standing beside her could see more clearly and reach more comfortably. Which is a fairly remarkable thing to sit with. An entire shift in medical practice adopted across an entire continent ended up working against the very biology it claimed to be improving, and it stuck around for centuries anyway because it served the person standing rather than the person labouring. There is one more small strange detail worth mentioning here because it tends to surprise people every time I bring it up. The formal medical term eventually attached to a woman lying on her back with her legs raised and supported did not originally have anything to do with childbirth at all. That specific position and its name were borrowed directly from an entirely unrelated surgical procedure, one developed for removing hard mineral stones from the bladder, a painful operation performed almost exclusively on men strapped down and braced open on a table, so a surgeon could work quickly with a blade before anesthesia even existed to soften the ordeal. Somewhere along the way, obstetric medicine simply adopted the exact same arrangement: legs, raised hips, exposed body angled for a surgeon's convenience, and never really bothered updating the name or questioning whether a position designed for stone removal actually belonged in a birthing room at all. Say that out loud to yourself for a second. The default position much of the modern world still associates with giving birth was borrowed wholesale from a procedure originally designed for a man's bladder, and somehow nobody ever circled back to rename it. If you have been paying attention across tonight's stories, you may already sense the pattern quietly repeating itself here, and I think it is worth saying out loud rather than leaving it implied. Ancient Egyptian women knelt on painted bricks. Roman women used a chair built with an opening in the seat. Countless traditions we've already walked through tonight across entirely different religions, and centuries arrived independently at some version of the exact same upright instinct. And then, over the course of roughly 200 years, a combination of male surgical convenience, a fashionable royal rumour, and a widely read medical textbook quietly overwrote nearly all of it, not because the new approach worked better, but because it looked more like surgery, and surgery by this point in history had started to look a great deal more respectable and more profitable than simply trusting a woman's own body and a steady pair of hands. It is a small pattern, repeated in a small room, but it is the exact same pattern that shows up again and again throughout this entire history, whenever convenience for the person holding the authority quietly gets rebranded as progress for the person actually doing the work. Here is a question worth sitting with while you listen tonight, wherever you happen to be lying yourself right now. If the position that best serves the person giving birth was known and practiced correctly for thousands of years before any of this began, what does it say about how medical decisions actually get made then and now that comfort for the person doing the work so often loses to convenience for the person standing over them? That question, as it happens, has not entirely gone away either. In recent decades, a growing number of midwives and birth centres have quietly begun reintroducing exactly the positions we spent the earlier part of tonight, exploring birthing stools brought back into modern use, squatting bars fitted onto ordinary hospital beds, simple encouragement to stay upright and moving rather than pinned flat on a mattress the entire time. Some hospitals now offer birthing pools allowing the same natural buoyancy that once helped a Roman midwife's patient ease into a stool to support a modern mother instead. It has taken the better part of 3 centuries, several academic studies, and a fair amount of quiet persistence from midwives willing to say the old way was not actually broken, but medicine is slowly circling back towards something ancient. Egyptian women and Roman midwives could have explained in a single sentence given the chance to speak, but convenience for the attendant standing at the foot of the bed did not stop with posture alone. It was about to reach for an actual tool, one so effective and so carefully hidden from the rest of the world that an entire family built a 100-year fortune around a secret locked inside a heavy gilded box one nobody outside their own bloodline was ever supposed to see opened. A blindfolded mother, a ringing bell to cover the sound, a carriage with the curtains drawn tight rattling through the streets of London toward a birth nobody else was permitted to properly witness. That story is next, and it is without question one of the strangest true stories in this entire history. The family at the centre of this next story did not start out rich or powerful, or even particularly welcome. In 1569, a Huguenot surgeon named William Chamberlain packed up his household in France and fled for his life, one of thousands of Protestant families forced out after a wave of religious persecution swept through the country, driven in large part by a queen mother determined to crush any faith that threatened her son's throne. He landed in Southampton with his wife and children, carrying little beyond his surgical training and whatever supplies had survived the crossing, and rebuilt a modest medical practice from nothing in a country whose language his family barely spoke. It is worth remembering that starting point clearly, because the story this family is actually remembered for decades of secrecy, royal patronage and quiet fortune, began with nothing more glamorous than a frightened refugee family trying to survive somewhere new. Two of his sons, both named Peter, for reasons the family never bothered explaining to. Later historians grew up to become barber surgeons like their father, then gradually folded midwifery into that trade as well. Peter the Elder eventually built a practice in London, respected enough to earn him a place as personal attendant to more than one queen, moving through royal circles that would have been entirely unreachable for a refugee family just one generation earlier. And somewhere in the midst of that rise, either Peter or someone very close to him developed a tool unlike anything used in a birthing room before, a pair of curved metal blades hinged together, designed to gently cradle an unborn baby's head and guide it out during a labour that had stalled dangerously long. The design itself improved quietly across the generations that followed, refinements the family never once wrote down for anyone outside their own bloodline. The earliest version used a simple rivet at the joint, stiff and awkward to manoeuvre inside a narrow birth canal, later swapped out for a small pivoting pin that let the two blades move far more naturally against each other. Later still, someone in the family threaded tape through a hole cut into each blade where they crossed, holding the tool steady without adding unnecessary bulk. The blades themselves were shaped with a gentle curve to match the rounded shape of an infant's skull, and small openings were cut through the metal to lighten the grip and reduce pressure on delicate tissue. This was not a lucky one-time discovery. It was a piece of medical engineering patiently improved over roughly a century, treated with the same secrecy a modern company might reserve for a formula worth billions. We now call that tool the obstetric forceps. At the time, the Chamberlain family simply called it the secret, and for the better part of 100 years that is exactly how they intended to keep it. Picture what that secrecy actually looked like inside an ordinary household, because the details, once you hear them properly laid out, sound almost more like a magic trick than medicine. When a Chamberlain arrived to attend a difficult birth, every servant, every relative, every other attendant in the house was asked to leave the room entirely. The labouring mother herself was blindfolded before the instrument ever touched her. Bells rang, sometimes deliberately. Sometimes assistants clattered other noisemakers near the door specifically to drown out any sound that might give away what was actually happening on the other side of it. The family travelled to these births in a carriage with the curtains drawn tightly shut, the enormous gilded case containing the instrument requiring 2 grown men just to carry it inside an object, built to look far more mysterious and complicated than it actually needed to be theatre-layered on top of medicine, purely to keep a paying family from ever glimpsing what they were actually paying for. Would you have gone along with it if you were the husband or mother waiting anxiously outside that door, desperate enough for your daughter or your wife to survive the night that you agreed to hand over an enormous sum of money without ever being allowed to see what exactly was buying her that chance? Most families understandably said yes without much hesitation at all. What choice really did they have? Stop and sit with that for a second, if you would, from the mother's side of the blindfold. You're already exhausted, already frightened, already deep into the hardest physical ordeal of your life, and now someone has covered your eyes as well, so that even the small comfort of seeing the room around you, the familiar faces you trust, has been taken away too, replaced by darkness, ringing bells and the muffled sound of strangers moving somewhere close to your body that you cannot track. Whatever the chamberlains told themselves about protecting their livelihood, it is worth remembering plainly that the method depended entirely on stripping a labouring woman of information about her own body at the exact moment she most needed to trust the people around her. This was not simply a family keeping a clever trick to themselves for a few years either. 3 full generations guarded this secret with real deliberate discipline, refining the design quietly along the way, all without ever once publishing a diagram or teaching an outsider the technique. And their ambitions eventually grew well past the instrument itself. At one point, a family member petitioned to have the College of Physicians formally recognise a new professional body specifically for licensing midwives structured so that chamberlains themselves would sit at the top of it, controlling in effect who could legally practice this kind of medicine across the country at all. Think about the scale of that ambition for a moment. This was not simply a family wanting to profit quietly from a clever invention. This was a family attempting to position itself as the official gatekeeper of an entire profession, granting or denying other women the legal right to work, while continuing to withhold the one tool that might have made all of their work considerably safer. The proposal was rejected. Ordinary midwives unsurprisingly wanted nothing to do with a licensing scheme designed and run by the very family hoarding the one tool that could have saved lives during their hardest cases. The story reaches its most dramatic and honestly its most damning moment in 1670, when a descendant named Hugh Chamberlain travelled to Paris, hoping to finally cash in on the family fortune properly, offering to sell the secret outright to the French government for a substantial sum, a fortune that would have set his branch of the family up comfortably for generations. Skeptical French physicians decided to test him before agreeing to anything, and the test they chose could not have been higher stakes. Hugh was brought to a woman who had been in obstructed labour for more than a week, her pelvis severely and permanently narrowed by illness, a case doctors of the era considered close to hopeless, without direct intervention. Every physician in that room understood exactly what was riding on the next few hours of fortune for Hugh if his mysterious device worked as promised, and quite possibly the very last chance this particular mother had left. If his secret instrument truly worked as well as the Chamberlain name suggested, here was his chance to prove it in front of the very officials who controlled the money he wanted. He failed. Both the mother and the child died during the attempt, and Hugh returned to England with nothing to show for the trip except a translated French medical text he picked up while he was there, a book written, as it happens, by a physician you may already recognise from earlier tonight, François Morisseau, the same man responsible for pushing so much of Europe toward labouring flat on the back in the first place. Hugh published that translation in England as a work called The Accomplished Midwife, quietly referencing his family's secret in the preface without ever actually explaining what it was. A strange little wink aimed at a public he still had no intention of letting in. Isn't there something almost unbearably ironic sitting inside that failure? A family that spent decades hoarding a truly life-saving tool for private profit travelled to another country, staked their entire fortune on a single desperate case, and lost both patients anyway, walking away with someone else's book instead of their own breakthrough. If you are looking for a tidy moral lesson buried inside this story, I think that particular afternoon in Paris might be the closest thing history hands you to one. It is worth pausing to note that not every Chamberlain spent his career purely on secrecy and showmanship. One member of the family, also confusingly named Peter, actually travelled to Italy and earned a formal medical degree from a respected university there, one of the very few in his bloodline to hold genuine academic credentials rather than simply inherited reputation. He spent years attempting and repeatedly failing to formalise his father's old ambition of a Chamberlain-run licensing body for midwives, each attempt collapsing under the same resistance the family had faced before. Even with a legitimate degree in hand, it seems nobody particularly trusted a family whose entire public reputation had been built on withholding rather than sharing. The secret finally slipped loose sometime around 1733, most historians believe through Hugh Chamberlain the Younger, who had no son of his own to inherit either the family name or its careful discretion. Around roughly the same period, remarkably similar forceps designs began appearing independently across parts of Belgium and France as well, which has left later historians honestly uncertain whether the Chamberlains were truly the sole inventors of the idea, or simply the family clever enough and secretive enough to profit from it longest. Once the design was finally out in the open, it spread with startling speed. A physician named William Smellie took the basic concept and meaningfully improved it within a matter of decades, publishing a full treatise on proper obstetric technique in 1752, refining the curve of the blades to better match a woman's actual anatomy, and introducing a locking mechanism that let the two halves of the tool be inserted one at a time, rather than forced in together, a small adjustment that made the entire instrument considerably safer in practiced hands. Within a single generation of finally becoming public, the very instrument three families of Chamberlains had once treated as sacred, unshareable property became a standard piece of equipment taught openly to any properly trained physician willing to learn it. And then, in an ending almost too fitting to invent the original Chamberlain forceps themselves, resurfaced in 1813, more than 100 years after Hugh the Elder's disastrous trip to Paris, discovered hidden beneath the attic floorboards of a family home in Essex by a completely unrelated family who had since moved in. One can only imagine the strange quiet shock of that moment, prying up an old board during ordinary repairs, and finding instead of dust and forgotten nails a small collection of tarnished, oddly shaped metal instruments. Nobody in the house had any context to understand relics of a secret that had already been public knowledge for 80 years by the time anyone actually laid eyes on the original tool itself. Nobody knows for certain exactly why they were left there, though the most persistent theory suggests Peter Chamberlain's own wife hid them away after his death, perhaps out of habit, perhaps still protecting a secret that by then hardly mattered to anyone but her. Do you ever wonder how many mothers and babies simply ran out of time waiting for a secret that could have reached them decades sooner? One writer from that era, reflecting bitterly on the whole affair after the truth finally came out, suggested that anyone capable of hiding something this useful for personal gain deserved to suffer for it himself for as long as he had made others suffer waiting. It is a harsh line, and I will admit I do not entirely disagree with the sentiment behind it. There is a particular kind of quiet cruelty in watching people struggle and die, with a solution sitting comfortably in a locked box simply because sharing it might have made someone slightly less wealthy. We tend to imagine villains in history as loud, obvious figures, tyrants and conquerors, but sometimes the quieter kind does just as much damage a respectable family and fine carriages, offering real help to whoever could afford the price of admission, and simply choosing again and again, across 3 separate generations, not to let anyone else in on how it actually worked. The forceps themselves, once finally public, quickly became standard medical equipment across Europe within a single generation, a tool almost every trained birth attendant eventually carried tucked into a leather bag, alongside lancets and bandages, no longer requiring a blindfold or a bell to disguise its use. But there was a much larger, much slower shift already underway, alongside that instrument, one that had very little to do with metal blades, and everything to do with who was considered qualified to hold them in the first place. Before the chamberlains, a man standing in a birthing room at all was still something of a novelty, tolerated only in genuine emergencies, when a midwife's own skill and hands had reached the limit of what they could safely manage. After them, that novelty had a name, a reputation, and eventually an entire growing profession built around it. A door had been pried open in that secretive chamberlain birthing room, blindfold and all, and once men had proven rightly or wrongly that they belonged inside it, that door never really swung shut again. Once that door stood open, the men walking through it came dressed for the occasion, and I mean that almost literally. By the early 1700s, a fashionable man attending a wealthy birth in London or Paris might arrive in a tailored coat carrying his own private set of polished instruments, charging fees far higher than any village midwife had ever dared to ask. For families with money to spend hiring one of these new accoucheurs, the polite French term everyone preferred over the blunter English phrase man midwife became something close to a status symbol, proof that you could afford the very latest thing medicine had to offer, whether or not it actually served you any better than what your own grandmother had relied on. There was, in a strange way, something almost performative about the whole arrangement, less a medical consultation and more a small private theatre, staged for an audience of exactly one worried family, reassured simply by the sight of a confident man in fine clothes standing at the foot of the bed. Not everyone welcomed the new arrivals quietly. In 1671, a woman named Jane Sharp herself, an experienced midwife with decades of hands-on practice behind her, published one of the very first printed midwifery guides written in English, and used a fair portion of it to take direct aim at exactly this trend, arguing plainly that men crowding into a role women had performed skillfully for generations were in her view motivated considerably more by profit than by any genuine improvement in care. She wrote in essence that many of these men understood far less about the female body than they liked to advertise, and that their confidence tended to outpace their actual competence by a rather wide margin. She was not simply an outside critic either sniping from a safe distance. She wrote from decades of hands-on experience herself, which makes her irritation land with considerably more weight than a modern reader might expect from a 17th century pamphlet, and gives us refreshingly an actual recorded voice from the women watching this profession get quietly taken from them. Even some of the men entering this new profession had reservations about where it was heading. A physician named John Mowbray, writing in 1724 in a work he called The Female Physician, openly acknowledged the shift toward male-attended childbirth taking hold around him, and then turned around and criticised his own colleagues rather sharply for what he saw as an unhealthy obsession with instruments, warning that reaching for a tool too quickly could cause exactly the kind of harm it claimed to prevent. He was in effect a man benefiting from the very trend he was cautioning against, which makes his warning feel considerably more honest than self-serving. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. This was never a simple unified march of confident men replacing foolish, superstitious women. It was messier than that, full of internal disagreement, competing egos, and more than a few honest voices on both sides of the argument trying to figure out in real time what actually kept a mother and her child alive. Something larger was shifting underneath all of this personal drama too, something worth pausing on directly. Because every single birth we have walked through together tonight, every century, every culture, every religion happened inside someone's own home. That changes now for the very first time in this entire story. Beginning around 1740, England started building an entirely new kind of institution, the lying-in hospital, a dedicated building where women, initially mostly poor women without private accoucheurs of their own, could go specifically to give birth under medical supervision, rows of beds instead of a single familiar room. Strangers instead of gossips gathered close a bell somewhere down the corridor instead of a fire crackling nearby. Alongside them, charitable outpatient services sprang up in cities to support women who still delivered at home but wanted a physician available if anything went seriously wrong. By the 1790s, somewhere between a third and half of all births across England involved a trained medical practitioner in some capacity, a remarkably staggering shift from a country where only a century earlier a man in the birthing room at all had been treated as a rare and slightly scandalous exception. Is that progress or is it loss? Honestly, I think the fair answer is both sitting uncomfortably together in the same decade. Real advances in the understanding of anatomy and physiology were happening during exactly this period, genuine medical curiosity pushing knowledge forward in ways that would eventually save lives no amount of herbal tradition alone could have saved. And at the very same time, something quieter and harder to measure was being lost, the community-centered woman-led ceremony. We spent so much time with earlier tonight the gossips gathered around the bed, the female network of skill passed hand to hand across generations, gradually being replaced by a colder, more clinical arrangement that treated birth less like a shared human event and more like a procedure performed on a patient. I do not think either version of that story is the complete truth on its own, and I am naturally suspicious of anyone in any century who tells it as though it were. There is one particular figure from this exact period whose legacy sits in that same uncomfortable middle ground, and I think it deserves being said plainly rather than glossed over. The same physician we already met tonight for his genuine improvements to forceps design also ran a well-known teaching practice in London, offering completely free midwifery care to poor women, specifically on one condition that his medical students be permitted to observe and sometimes practice on the women receiving that free care. Dozens of young men learned their entire hands-on obstetric training this way, training that would go on to save countless lives across the following decades. It undeniably trained an entire generation of safer, more competent practitioners. It also meant that the women whose bodies made that education possible were by simple economic necessity in no real position to say no grateful, simply to receive care they could not otherwise afford, whatever conditions came quietly attached to it. Progress once again quietly financed by the people with the least power to refuse it. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment before we go further. When a doctor today asks your permission before a procedure, have you ever really stopped to think about how recently, historically speaking, that simple courtesy became something patients could actually expect, rather than something they had to be grateful for receiving at all? For the poorest women of this period, medical care and quiet obligation arrived as a single package deal, and nobody thought to separate the two because nobody in a position of real authority had much reason to. The clearest, most devastating illustration of how uncertain this new profession still was, even at its most prestigious level, arrived in 1817, and it involved the one woman in England whose survival mattered more politically than almost anyone else's. Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate grandchild of the reigning king, and next in line to eventually inherit the throne herself, was 21 years old recently, and happily married, and enormously popular with a public that had watched her entire pregnancy with something close to national obsession, newspapers tracking her health crowds, gathering outside her residence hoping for news. Her attending accoucheur, a physician named Richard Croft, was about as well credentialed as anyone in England could be for the job, trained under respected London surgeons, and married into a family of established obstetric physicians himself. This was not a case of an unqualified man stumbling into a role beyond him. If the very best the profession had to offer could still end this badly, what did that actually say about how much real control anyone in that room truly had over what was about to happen? Croft guided Charlotte through a labour that stretched past 50 hours, an almost unimaginable ordeal by any standard, made worse by weeks of restrictive bleeding and dieting beforehand, a treatment considered sound medical practice at the time for a pregnancy showing signs of complication. At one point, another physician diagnosed the baby lying in a difficult sideways position, a case where forceps might reasonably have been considered. Croft chose not to use them. I want to sit with that decision honestly rather than simply condemning it with the comfortable benefit of 2 centuries of hindsight. Forceps at this exact moment in history had earned a truly frightening reputation, responsible for crushed skulls, torn tissue and fatal infection, often enough that plenty of careful, competent physicians had grown deliberately cautious about reaching for them. Croft weighed the real risk of the instrument injuring the princess even further against the risk of leaving her be, and made the call that a great many equally trained men of his era would likely have made in his position. The baby, a 9-pound boy, was stillborn. Several hours later, the princess herself died as well, most accounts at the time attributing it to bleeding that would not stop, though researchers looking back at the case generations later have suggested a blood clot reaching her lungs may be the more accurate explanation, a condition no physician of 1817 had any way of recognizing or treating regardless. The public reaction was immediate and merciless. An entire nation had been anticipating this birth, and grief curdled quickly into blame, nearly all of it aimed squarely at Croft newspapers and pamphlets, openly questioning his competence, friends and colleagues quietly distancing themselves, the same crowds who had once gathered outside her residence hoping for good news, now murmuring his name with something closer to contempt. 3 months later, while attending a completely different woman through her own labour in a different house entirely, Croft excused himself, found a pistol nearby and took his own life. According to a detail that has followed the story ever since, though historians treat it with appropriate caution, given how neatly it fits the tragedy, a book of Shakespeare was later found open beside him. Historians have come to call the whole affair the triple obstetric tragedy: child, mother and physician, 3 lives lost from a single event that no single decision, forceps or otherwise, may have ever been capable of preventing. What strikes me most about that story, honestly, is what happened to the profession afterward. Rather than settling into caution, the medical establishment swung hard in the opposite direction. Physicians who favoured earlier, more aggressive use of forceps, gaining considerably more influence and credibility in the years that followed, largely because Croft's caution had become so publicly catastrophically associated with failure. A tragedy born partly from fear of intervening, too much ended up teaching an entire generation of doctors the opposite lesson, that intervening too little was the greater danger, which is exactly the kind of overcorrection history tends to repeat whenever a single highly visible failure gets treated as the whole truth about a much more complicated problem. One frightened, well-intentioned decision made under conditions no modern doctor would ever have to face, alone ended up quietly steering an entire profession for decades afterward, an entire field of medicine essentially relearning its own instincts, based on the outcome of one impossibly difficult night inside one royal bedroom. It makes you wonder how many quieter, unrecorded tragedies in ordinary households across the same decades never received nearly that much scrutiny, or taught anyone watching a single useful lesson at all, simply because the mother involved was not destined to be queen. It was only a little over a decade after Charlotte's death in 1828 that a British physician finally proposed a single proper word for what these men had become: obstetrician, replacing the older, clumsier term man-midwife, once and for all a tidy, respectable label for what had grown into a genuine and increasingly powerful profession. If that word sounds at all familiar to you tonight, it should. It comes directly from the Latin term for a midwife herself, the very same obstetrics we spent time with earlier this evening, the skilled women of ancient Rome, who once knelt beside low wooden chairs, guiding births with nothing but trained hands and patience, women whose social standing never remotely matched the fees these new obstetricians would soon command. The men claiming this new respectable high-paying profession quite literally borrowed their entire title from the women they were in practice working to replace. I do not think that irony was intentional. I also do not think it makes it any less striking or any less worth sitting with quietly for a moment before we move on. While Britain wrestled publicly with royal tragedy, institutional hospitals, and a brand new professional title, an entirely different, far quieter story was unfolding across the ocean, one that never made a single newspaper headline and never needed to, because nobody involved was famous enough to attract that kind of attention in the first place. It was recorded not in royal autopsy reports or parliamentary debate, but in the plain ink-stained pages of one woman's private diary, kept faithfully by candlelight in a small house on the edge of the American wilderness, an ordinary midwife quietly delivering hundreds of babies with a success rate that frankly would have made half of London's finest accoucheurs rather uncomfortable to sit with. Her name was Martha Ballard, and she never once set foot in London, never met a king, never had her name printed in a newspaper while she was alive to read it. She lived on the edge of the Kennebec River in the district of Maine, in a small settlement that would eventually become the town of Augusta, and for 27 years she kept a private diary that nobody outside her own household bothered reading closely, right up until the moment generations after her death, when one historian finally sat down and actually did. It is without question one of my favourite discoveries in this entire history, precisely because nobody involved in writing it ever imagined it would matter to anyone at all. Picture the setting first, because it matters. This was not London with its paved streets and lying in hospitals and physicians in tailored coats. This was frontier Massachusetts, soon to become its own separate state, a place where the river froze solid from November clear through April, where a midwife answering a call in the middle of the night might have to cross that same river on foot over the ice, or paddle a canoe through freezing water if the ice had not fully set, or ride a borrowed horse down a barely cleared trail in the dark, sometimes falling off it along the way. Black flies plagued the settlement in summer, thick enough to leave welts on exposed skin, and mud-swallowed roads whole, every spring thaw a season. Locals eventually just started calling mud season outright because there was no more elegant way to describe it. There was no colleague down the hall to consult. There was no hospital to send a difficult case to if things went badly. There was Martha, her herbs, her hands, and whatever daylight or lantern light happened to be available when she arrived. She began keeping her diary in January of 1785, already 50 years old by then, an age when plenty of women of her era might have considered their most demanding working years behind them. Martha's were only just accelerating. Using ink she mixed herself and quills cut from the geese she kept in her own yard, she wrote almost every single day for the next 27 years, close to 10,000 entries in total, an achievement made even more remarkable by the plain fact that she could read and write at all. Most girls of her generation received just enough education to make their way through a Bible, if that. Martha's family had closer ties to medicine than most. An uncle and a brother-in-law both practiced as physicians, and that connection likely opened a door to literacy that stayed firmly closed for a great many of her neighbours. She also kept a substantial herb garden behind her house, growing and gathering the raw material for tea salves, and syrup she mixed herself an entire working pharmacy, tucked quietly into her own backyard, restocked every growing season with nothing more than seed soil and decades of accumulated trial and error. What she actually wrote about day after day tells you almost everything about the true texture of her life. Weather came first, nearly always, whether it snowed or thawed, whether the garden needed tending. Then the ordinary business of running a household, spinning, cooking, tending the animals, and tucked in among all of that almost matter-of-fact in tone entries recording exactly which neighbour she'd been called to see overnight how the labour had gone, whether mother and child were resting comfortably by the time she finally made her way home. A typical entry from a rough winter night might simply note the falling snow mention that she left a new mother resting as comfortably as could be expected by early afternoon, then describe walking home across the frozen river because no boat could safely cross before closing, with whatever small domestic task waited for her once she finally reached her own door. She rarely dramatized any of it. Reading her words, you get the distinct sense of a woman for whom delivering a baby in the middle of a snowstorm was simply Tuesday one more task on an already exhausting list, worth noting briefly, and then setting aside to make room for the next day's entry. Here are the numbers because they matter enormously, and I want you to actually sit with them rather than let them slide past. Across the years covered by her diary, Martha delivered somewhere around 816 babies. Accounting for the years she practiced before she ever started writing anything down her own rough personal tally, placed her lifetime total closer to 990, right in the neighbourhood of that figure I mentioned to you earlier tonight. Out of all of those deliveries, she lost 5 mothers. 5 across nearly 1,000 births spanning an era when we already established tonight that something close to 1 woman in every 8 or 9 who spent her adult life bearing children could expect to die from it eventually. Martha's own personal rate sat dramatically, almost improbably better than that grim average in a period with no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no hospital to fall back on if something went wrong. 20 of the infants she delivered did not survive as well, a real and heavy toll on its own, though set against the broader infant mortality of her era, still a remarkably steady record for one working woman alone across nearly 3 decades of practice in one of the harshest climates in the entire country. How does an untrained countrywoman with a homemade inkpot outperform the mortality statistics of an entire era? I do not think the honest answer is luck, though I am sure she had some. I think the answer is closer to what we have circled back to again and again tonight. Patience. Careful observation repeated across hundreds and hundreds of cases, a genuine willingness to let a difficult labour take the time it needed, rather than rushing toward intervention out of impatience or fear of blame. She had no forceps waiting in a locked box, no professional reputation riding on, looking decisive in front of an audience, no crowd of anxious newspaper men outside her door. She had only the accumulated memory of the last 800 births to draw on, and the freedom to trust that memory without anyone questioning her right to use it. Martha was in every meaningful sense running her own small, unglamorous clinical trial for nearly 3 decades, and the results, quietly recorded in her own handwriting, speak for themselves rather convincingly. Her relationship with a handful of formally trained physicians in her area is worth noting too, because it looked almost nothing like the tense professional rivalry we just spent time with across the ocean. Local doctors in her community occasionally invited Martha to sit in on autopsies and dissections alongside them, treating her, at least in these moments, as something closer to a respected colleague than a competitor. To be pushed aside, her decades of hands-on experience apparently worth more to them than whatever credential she lacked on paper. It is a small detail easy to miss, but it tells you something meaningful about how differently this dynamic could play out, depending entirely on the community around it. In London, status and money and fashion pushed women out of a profession. They had long dominated an entire industry built partly on appearances. In a small settlement on the Kennebec River, survival depended so heavily on every available skilled hand that nobody had much patience left over for turf wars, or for questioning whether the person saving your neighbour's life had the proper paperwork to be doing it. None of this means her own life was somehow gentler or easier than anyone else's during this period, and it would do her memory a disservice to pretend otherwise. Martha buried 3 of her own 9 children during a diphtheria epidemic that tore through her community grief she carried quietly into rooms where she was expected to bring comfort and steady hands to somebody else's family the very next week, sometimes the very next day. Later in her life, her husband was thrown into debtor's prison, a humiliation that would have shadowed any household of the era, and one of her surviving sons faced a fraud charge that shadowed the family's reputation for years afterward. She delivered babies through all of it, the epidemic, the imprisonment, the scandal, apparently without ever once considering that her own private sorrow gave her an excuse to stop showing up for other people's hardest nights. Her diary rarely lingers on her own pain for more than a line or 2 before returning, almost stubbornly, to the practical business of the day ahead. Can you imagine carrying that kind of grief privately year after year, while still being the calm, steady presence everyone else in your community depended on during their own worst moments? I find something quietly remarkable in that the sheer unglamorous endurance of it far more than in any dramatic royal tragedy. For more than a century after her death in 1812, almost nobody outside her direct descendants thought Martha's diary was worth much attention at all. It was passed down quietly within the family, eventually landing at the main state library, where historians who glanced at it dismissed the writing as repetitive ordinary, hardly the stuff of serious scholarship, endless notes about weather and garden chores, punctuated by births that all began to blur together after a while, if you were not reading closely enough. It took a historian named Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, working in the 1980s, to actually sit with those pages properly cross-referencing names, dates and court records until an entire hidden world of frontier life slowly came into focus behind what had once looked like tedious repetition. She recognized that repetition itself was exactly the point, an unbroken day-by-day record of a working woman's entire professional and domestic life, richer and more honest than almost any polished memoir could have offered, precisely because nobody writing it ever imagined a stranger would one day be reading it so closely. Her resulting book, published in 1990, won a Pulitzer Prize the following year, and eventually became a television documentary as well, transforming a diary once considered too plain to matter into one of the most celebrated primary sources in early American history. There is something worth sitting with in that timeline all on its own. A woman's meticulous, decades-long record of saving lives sat quietly unread and undervalued for the better part of 200 years, dismissed as boring until someone finally took women's ordinary daily labour seriously enough to actually look closely at what it contained. I suspect that particular pattern extends considerably further than one diary in Maine. The family Martha left behind carries its own quiet postscript worth mentioning before we move on. One of her granddaughters eventually inherited the diary directly, and went on decades later to graduate from a women's medical college herself, formally earning the kind of medical credential nobody would have even offered to Martha. In her own lifetime, a straight, unbroken line running from an untrained countrywoman with an herb garden to a formally certified physician carrying her own grandmother's handwritten pages. It would take until 37 years after Martha's death for any woman in this country to graduate from a proper medical school at all, a stark reminder of just how much skill Martha and thousands of women like her had quietly practiced for generations before the country's institutions were willing to officially recognize any of it. And further down that same family line, a descendant named Clara Barton would go on to found the organization that eventually became the American Red Cross, carrying the same instinct for showing up in other people's worst moments that had defined her own ancestors' entire working life, one snowy river crossing at a time. Martha Ballard's story survived because a piece of paper happened to survive passed carefully hand to hand for nearly 2 centuries, until the right person finally opened it at the right moment. But paper was, and always has been, a fragile, unreliable place to store a life's worth of skill. Ink fades, houses burn, families move on, and old journals get boxed up in an attic and quietly forgotten, or worse, thrown out by a well-meaning relative who has no idea what they're actually holding. For every diary like hers that made it into a library archive and eventually into a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, countless other women working in circumstances considerably harder than a frontier winter in Maine left no pages behind at all, no ink, no quill, nothing but the quiet, uncredited fact that generations of families survived because they showed up again and again in the middle of the night in the worst weather, for people who could rarely pay them properly and never once thought to write any of it down. That particular kind of erasure runs even deeper once you cross further south into communities where the women doing this work were denied not just a place in the history books, but for a long stretch of this country's own past, denied even the basic right to their own freedom while they were doing it. That particular kind of erasure runs deepest in the American South, in communities where the women doing this work were for generations denied not just recognition, but the most basic right of all ownership of their own bodies and their own freedom, even while they held the bodies of others in their hands at the most vulnerable moment of a human life. This is without question one of the harder stories in this entire history to sit with properly, and I want to walk through it with the honesty and care it actually deserves rather than rushing past the uncomfortable parts. Historians tracing the earliest roots of this story point all the way back to 1619, the same year the first enslaved Africans were brought to English North America at Point Comfort in Virginia. Among the women forced onto those ships and into that unimaginable new life, some carried with them genuine generations' deep knowledge of midwifery techniques and herbal remedies, rooted in West African tradition knowledge that had absolutely nothing to do with the country they'd just been dragged into, and everything to do with the world they'd been stolen from. That knowledge did not disappear even under conditions specifically designed to strip away everything a person carried with them. It travelled quietly inside the women who survived the crossing, whispered from mother to daughter, from one generation of enslaved women to the next, and it would go on to shape childbirth across the American South for the next 3 centuries, long after the ships themselves had been forgotten by almost everyone except the families whose lives they had permanently altered. Here is a detail worth sitting with because it captures something truly complicated about this entire chapter of history. Enslaved midwives frequently cared for 2 completely separate communities, at once delivering the children of enslaved women in the same plantation quarters, where they themselves had no legal right to their own bodies, and often on the very same day being called into the main house to attend the birth of the plantation owner's own wife or daughter. A woman with no freedom of her own was routinely trusted with the single most intimate, most dangerous moment in the life of the family that legally owned her present at the exact instant when that family's future heir first drew breath, holding quite literally the continuation of a household that considered her property rather than a person. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because I do not think there is any tidy way to resolve it. It tells you all at once how remarkably skilled these women were, skilled enough that even a slave-holding household staked its own survival on their hands, and how completely that same skill was divorced from any corresponding respect for their humanity the rest of the time. A skilled midwife might occasionally receive small payments or a measure of freedom to travel between households that most enslaved people were never granted a narrow conditional respect that never once extended to actual freedom itself. There is a harder truth tucked inside this history too, one worth saying plainly rather than skating past. Enslaved women had almost no control over their own reproduction, their bodies subject to forced pregnancy and routine sexual violence under a system designed explicitly to produce more enslaved labourers, a horror I am not going to dwell on beyond simply naming it honestly. Within that context, midwives sometimes became something else entirely quiet, keepers of herbal knowledge that could delay a pregnancy or end one offering enslaved women, one of the only forms of bodily autonomy available to them at all, passed along in careful whispers between women who trusted each other with their lives. I am not going to walk you through the details of how, because that is not really the point here, and frankly it is not information this particular evening needs to carry. What matters is the fact itself, that even inside a system built to strip women of every form of control over their own lives, a network of midwives quietly preserved one narrow, dangerous and deeply human form of resistance, practiced at enormous personal risk should it ever have been discovered. The way this knowledge actually moved from one generation to the next deserves a moment of its own too. There was no school, no textbook, no formal license involved anywhere in the process. A girl learned by walking alongside an older midwife, often her own mother or grandmother for years before she ever caught a baby on her own, carrying the bag, watching the hands, absorbing the rhythm of the difficult labour, long before anyone officially called her ready. By the time she finally took on her own patients, she carried inside her an unbroken chain of practical experience stretching back quite literally across the ocean, refined and adapted generation after generation to fit whatever plants and circumstances a new home happened to offer. After emancipation, this same tradition did not simply vanish the way you might expect given how completely the legal landscape had just changed around it. It grew, if anything, becoming even more essential to the daily survival of an entire region. Formerly freed, but still largely locked out of hospitals, still frequently unable to afford or access a white physician, and often actively turned away from what limited medical care did exist nearby, black communities across the rural South leaned even more heavily on midwives who had already spent generations perfecting exactly this kind of care. By the 1920s and 30s, these women, commonly known throughout the region as granny midwives, attended somewhere around 3 out of every 4 births across large portions of the rural South. In Mississippi specifically, researchers have found the number climbing even higher, closer to 88% of all births statewide handled by black midwives well into the 20th century. Think about that figure honestly for a moment. The overwhelming majority of an entire state's population, black and white families alike, quite literally entered this world through the hands of women. The surrounding legal and medical establishment treated as an afterthought at best. A granny midwife's actual role reached considerably further than the birth itself too. She was frequently the only person in an entire rural community with any real medical knowledge at all, treating fevers, setting minor injuries, mixing herbal remedies, passed down through her own family for generations, and returning again and again after the birth to check on mother and child through the weeks that followed, a level of ongoing personal care most modern patients would consider almost unimaginably thorough today. She held a spiritual role too in many communities, blessing a new arrival, offering prayer alongside practical medicine, treating birth as something sacred rather than purely clinical, in a tradition that traced directly back to the West African roots we started this story with. She was in the fullest sense of the word a pillar, the person a family called first trusted completely, long before anyone thought to call her a professional at all. In an era when that particular word was reserved almost exclusively for people who looked nothing like her, would you be surprised to learn that rather than simply being pushed aside the way midwives had been in England a century earlier, at least one serious American effort actually tried to formally train and elevate these women instead. Tuskegee, the historically black university in Alabama founded by Booker T. Washington, established a dedicated program specifically to train black nurse midwives, combining the existing folk knowledge these women already carried with formal instruction in anatomy, sanitation, and record keeping, graduating a small but meaningful number of formally credentialed practitioners, roughly 31 students in total, before the program eventually closed in the 1940s. It stands as a genuine counterexample to almost everything else in this particular chapter, proof that recognizing and formalizing this skill, rather than simply legislating it out of existence, was absolutely possible when the people in charge actually chose to try, and a quiet reminder of how much more good could have been done had that same choice been made more widely across the region. One woman in particular gives this entire era a face rather than just a statistic. Mary Coley, working in rural Georgia through the middle of the 20th century, became the subject of a public health training film released in 1952, documenting her actual work, delivering babies across her community with warmth, competence, and an unmistakable authority that came from decades of hard-won experience. The camera follows her walking dirt roads with her bag in hand, greeting families by name, moving through a birth with the calm, practiced confidence of someone who has honestly lost count of how many times she has done exactly this before. That film survives today, preserved decades later in the National Film Registry as a document of genuine historical importance. One of the only moving pictures we have showing exactly what this work actually looked like in an actual woman's actual hands, rather than filtered through someone else's second-hand description of it. Watching it now, it is almost startling how ordinary her competence looks on screen, which is in its own quiet way the entire point. And then gradually, deliberately, this entire tradition was legislated into near extinction. Public health officials in the early decades of the 20th century launched organized campaigns specifically targeting granny midwives, framing the effort as modernization and safety, while the language used in official reports from the period tells a rather less flattering story, underneath that framing describing older experienced black midwives in openly dismissive, occasionally outright insulting terms, while praising a supposedly improved, more compliant generation being trained to replace them. New licensing laws swept across southern states through the 1910s and 20s, requiring formal registration, standardized bags of approved supplies and repeated inspection visits from white public health nurses, who often knew considerably less about actual childbirth than the women they were now empowered to grade and correct. The effect was swift and in many places devastating. In Alabama alone, a single new licensing requirement effectively ended the careers of roughly 150 granny midwives, almost overnight women with decades of hands-on experience, suddenly disqualified by paperwork requirements that had nothing whatsoever to do with their actual competence and everything to do with a system that had simply decided their kind of knowledge no longer counted as legitimate. Here is a question I find myself truly sitting with. If a system spends decades relying on someone's skill to keep an entire region's mothers and children alive, and then dismantles her livelihood the moment it finally has the administrative power to do so, what does that actually tell you about whose competence was ever really being evaluated and whose simply was not? By the middle of the 20th century, granny midwives had all but disappeared from official practice across most of the South, their knowledge surviving mainly in family memory, in a handful of preserved oral histories, and in exactly one carefully filmed public health documentary. Entire lineages of medical skill refined across 3 centuries and multiple continents, narrowed down to a small stack of archives and a single reel of film simply because nobody in a position of official authority thought it worth writing down properly while there was still time. Somewhere in that gap between what was actually known and what was ever officially recorded, an entire library's worth of human expertise simply evaporated, taking with it whatever specific remedies, whatever careful, hard-won knowledge those women never had the chance to pass on to anyone still listening. It is worth noting honestly before we move on that the consequences of that disappearance did not stay neatly confined to the past. Disparities in maternal health outcomes along racial lines persist in this country. Today, a complicated modern issue with many contributing causes, but one that historians studying this exact period consistently point back to, at least in part, when tracing how an entire skilled, trusted, deeply rooted network of care was so thoroughly dismantled in such a short span of time. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that something valuable was lost here, not just to the women themselves, but to the entire country that quietly let it happen. While these southern communities were losing their most trusted caregivers to a stack of new paperwork, an ocean away decades earlier, a doctor in Vienna had already spent years trying and mostly failing to convince his own colleagues of something almost embarrassingly simple, something that could have saved countless lives on both continents if anyone with real authority had simply been willing to listen to him in time. He was not fighting against ignorance exactly. He was fighting against pride, professional reputation, and the deeply uncomfortable possibility that the very hands meant to save a mother's life might, without anyone realizing it, have been the ones quietly ending it instead. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and the story of what he discovered, what it cost him personally to prove it, and how long it took anyone with real power to actually believe him, might be the single most frustrating chapter in this entire history. Frustrating not because the science was complicated, it truly was not. Frustrating because the solution turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple, and the people standing in its way were the very same men whose job was supposedly to save lives. Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s ran 2 separate maternity divisions inside the very same building, close enough that a woman in labour could hear activity from both wards through the shared walls. The first was staffed by physicians and medical students considered on paper the more prestigious and medically advanced option. The second was staffed entirely by midwives generally seen as the plainer, less scientifically impressive choice. And here is the detail that should stop you. Cold. Women admitted to the physician-run ward died from a raging fever within days of delivery at roughly 3 times the rate of women admitted to the midwife-run ward, right down the same corridor, inside the very same hospital, under the very same roof, breathing in theory the very same air. This was not a rumour whispered between patients. It was a documented, measurable, entirely real pattern tracked in the hospital's own admission records, and it terrified the women arriving at that hospital's front door badly enough that some of them begged to be assigned to the midwives instead. And a number of desperate women reportedly chose to deliver their babies out in the street, unattended, cold and frightened, rather than risk being placed on the doctor's ward at all. Think about that for a moment. Women were choosing the danger of an unassisted street birth over the supposedly superior care of trained physicians, purely because word had spread correctly about which door was more likely to send you home alive. Semmelweis, a young Hungarian physician who'd originally trained in law before switching to medicine, took a position at that hospital in the mid-1840s, and the gap between those two wards bothered him in a way apparently did not bother most of his more senior colleagues, who tended to shrug it off as one of those unfortunate, unexplainable facts of medicine. He began testing theories the way any careful, honest investigator would, checking overcrowding, checking ventilation, checking whether women in the physician's ward were simply examined more roughly, even testing whether the specific position women delivered in on each ward made a difference. He ruled out explanation after explanation one by one with the patient thoroughness of a man who honestly wanted the actual answer rather than a comfortable one. None of it explained a death rate 3 times higher just a few doors down the hall. The answer arrived tragically through the death of a friend. A colleague of his, a pathologist named Jakob Kolečka, accidentally cut his finger while performing an autopsy on a woman who had died of exactly this same raging fever, a small, ordinary slip of the kind that happened in autopsy rooms all the time and rarely amounted to anything serious. This time it did. Kolečka fell ill almost immediately afterward, developing symptoms that mirrored disturbingly closely the very illness killing new mothers just down the corridor from his own laboratory. Fever chills, a rapid and frightening decline. He died within days. And in that death, in the grief of losing a close colleague to something that looked so eerily like the disease he had already spent months investigating, Semmelweis found the thread he had been missing. The physicians and medical students on his ward routinely spent their mornings performing autopsies in that same building, elbow deep in the tissue of the recently deceased, then walked directly to the maternity ward afterward to examine labouring women's hands unwashed beyond a cursory rinse, carrying with them, though nobody yet had a word for it, invisible material from the corpses they had just been handling. The midwives on the other ward never once set foot in the autopsy room. That Semmelweis became convinced was the entire difference. Would you have believed him if you were standing in that hospital in 1847 being asked to accept that your own hands, the same hands you used to heal people, might actually be the thing killing them? It is worth pausing on how remarkably strange that idea must have sounded at the time, decades before anyone had proof that invisible organisms existed at all, let alone that they could travel from a corpse to a living patient on nothing more than an unwashed palm. Semmelweis instituted a simple new rule on his ward in 1847. Before examining any patient, physicians and students were required to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, a strong, sharply scented antiseptic chosen, specifically because it seemed to eliminate the lingering smell of decay that clung to hands after an autopsy, a smell Semmelweis suspected correctly as it turned out was connected to whatever invisible substance was actually causing the infections. Not everyone on the ward welcomed the new requirement warmly. Several colleagues reportedly found the whole idea faintly insulting a young foreign doctor, implying that their hands, the hands of educated men, required scrubbing like a servant's before touching a patient. But the results arrived almost immediately, and they were staggering, impossible to argue with no matter how offended anyone felt about the method. Mortality on his ward dropped from somewhere around 18% down to under 2% within a matter of months, a reduction so dramatic that by any honest modern standard, it should have made Semmelweis one of the most celebrated physicians in Europe practically overnight. It did not, and this is the part of the story I find myself returning to again and again because I do not think it is really a story about medicine at all. It is a story about pride. The dominant medical theory of the era held that disease travelled through something called miasma, essentially bad air, foul-smelling vapours, rising from decaying matter and spreading illness on their own, an idea comfortable enough that it had gone largely unchallenged for centuries. Semmelweis's evidence directly contradicted that comfortable familiar theory, and worse, it placed the blame squarely on the very physicians treating these women, men who considered themselves educated, respectable, and entirely incapable of accidentally killing their own patients through simple carelessness. Accepting his findings meant accepting that they themselves, not bad air, not fate, not the patient's own constitutions, had been the ones carrying death from the autopsy table to the birthing bed on their own two hands, a conclusion that struck at the very heart of how these men understood their own professional identity. That is an almost unbearable thing to ask a proud man to admit, and a great many of Vienna's most respected physicians simply refused to, preferring instead to find fault with Semmelweis himself, his temperament, his nationality, his manner of presenting evidence, anything at all that let them avoid looking directly at their own hands. Semmelweis, to his credit and eventually to his considerable detriment, did not handle this rejection quietly. As the years passed and his colleagues continued to dismiss his findings, publishing counter-arguments, quietly declining to adopt his methods, or simply ignoring him altogether, his frustration curdled into something sharper. He began writing open letters directly to prominent obstetricians across Europe, some of them extraordinarily blunt, accusing men who refused to adopt basic hand-washing of being in effect responsible for the deaths piling up on their own wards, calling them in essence murderers who simply had not yet noticed their own guilt. He was not wrong, strictly speaking, and I think that particular detail matters. But being right rarely wins you friends when you deliver it that way, and the medical establishment of Vienna grew increasingly hostile toward him, rather than increasingly convinced, closing ranks the way proud institutions so often do when someone outside their comfortable consensus keeps insisting loudly and repeatedly that they are the ones causing harm. His personal life unravelled alongside his professional standing. By his mid-40s, those closest to him described a man growing erratic, exhausted, and increasingly difficult to reach, prone to outbursts and strange obsessive behaviour that alarmed even his own family, whether from the sheer accumulated weight of being right and ignored for 2 decades or from a deteriorating medical condition. Historians still debate today quite possibly some form of early dementia compounded by exhaustion and heavy drinking. In 1865, he was committed to an asylum reportedly under circumstances involving considerable force, tricked into the visit by colleagues who feared what he might do to his own career, or to himself if left unchecked any longer. Within days of his admission, he sustained an injury by most accounts, a wound to his hand quite possibly inflicted during a struggle with the guards restraining him, and developed a raging infection from it, the wound swelling, reddening, spreading exactly the way an untreated infection does when nobody intervenes in time. He died 2 weeks later at the age of 47, in a small locked room considerably far removed from the hospital ward where he had once fought so hard and so publicly to convince the world that dirty hands could kill. I want you to sit with that ending for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. The man who spent nearly 2 decades trying to convince the medical world that infection travelled invisibly from an untreated wound into a vulnerable body, dismissed and mocked for it, the entire time died from precisely that mechanism, an infected wound untreated in the very institution meant to be caring for him. If you set out to write a piece of fiction about tragic historical irony, I do not think you could improve on the truth here, even if you tried. Vindication, when it finally arrived, came too late to do him any good personally. Within 20 years of his death, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur studying fermentation and spoilage, and a British surgeon named Joseph Lister, working with wound infections in his own operating theatre, independently built the actual scientific framework Semmelweis had been missing the entire time, proving conclusively that invisible microorganisms did exist, did spread disease, and could indeed travel exactly the way Semmelweis had insisted they must, from an unwashed hand onto a vulnerable patient. Lister in particular would go on to build an entire system of antiseptic surgery around principles that in hindsight Semmelweis had already stumbled onto decades earlier, purely through careful observation and a refusal to accept an explanation that did not actually fit the evidence in front of him. Suddenly, the strange, insulting theory of a dead Hungarian obstetrician was not strange or insulting at all. It was simply correct and had been correct the entire time he was being ridiculed for saying it out loud. His name has since become attached to something far larger than one hospital ward in Vienna. Researchers studying human behaviour eventually coined a term, the Semmelweis reflex, to describe our collective, remarkably consistent tendency to reject new evidence outright. Not because it is poorly argued, but simply because it contradicts what we already comfortably believe, especially when accepting it would mean admitting our own hands were part of the problem. It shows up far beyond medicine too, in boardrooms, in scientific fields of every kind, in ordinary arguments between ordinary people who would rather defend a familiar wrong idea than sit with the discomfort of having been mistaken in front of others. That is honestly a strikingly familiar shape for a pattern we've now traced across nearly every single story. Tonight, a family hoarding a cure for profit, a profession blaming caution instead of its own limitations, an entire licensing system dismantling skilled women rather than learning from them. Different centuries, different countries, remarkably similar failure of nerve, and remarkably similar excuses offered afterward to make that failure feel a little less damning in hindsight. Here is a question worth carrying with you for the rest of the night. If the evidence sitting directly in front of you demanded you admit you had, without meaning to, been contributing to harm this entire time, are you certain you would accept it any faster than Vienna's proudest physicians did? Infection at least finally had a name, a cause, and eventually a solution the rest of the medical world would slowly, reluctantly come around to trusting. But infection was never the only danger a woman faced in that room, and it was certainly not the only thing medicine would eventually promise to fix for her, sometimes with results considerably more complicated than a simple wash of the hands. For most of the history we've walked through together tonight, pain was simply accepted as part of the arrangement, something to be endured, managed with herbs and patience and a steady hand to grip, but rarely something anyone seriously imagined eliminating altogether. That began to shift in the middle of the 1800s, and the story of how it shifted turns out to be a remarkably strange one, involving a chemical first discovered at what was essentially a party trick gone right. A queen who quietly defied her own church, and several decades later a supposedly liberating medical fashion that ended in restraint screaming and padded cribs. Let us start with the party trick, because I promise you it is exactly as unusual as it sounds. In the mid-1840s, an Edinburgh obstetrician named James Young Simpson had been searching for anything that might ease the agony of a difficult labour, and he tested his candidates the way plenty of scientists of his era tested things on himself, and a small circle of willing friends gathered around his own dining table one evening after dinner, sniffing one unpromising chemical after another, and comparing notes with the mild disappointment of men hoping for something considerably more interesting to report. They took turns inhaling a new chemical compound, comparing notes on the sensation, until at some point in the evening several of them simply collapsed unconscious onto the floor chairs, toppling conversation cutting off mid-sentence. When Simpson came to and realized none of them were hurt, only deeply, thoroughly asleep, he understood immediately what he was holding. That chemical was chloroform, and within months he was administering it to labouring women, becoming one of the loudest, most persistent champions obstetric pain relief has ever had. Not everyone welcomed the idea warmly, and the resistance he ran into was not really medical at all, it was theological. A long-standing reading of the biblical account of Eve held that the pain of childbirth was a divinely ordained punishment handed down specifically to women as a consequence of the very first sin, and that interfering with it amounted to defying Scripture itself, deliberately undoing a judgment that God himself had personally handed down. Scotland's own Calvinist church establishment pushed back hard against the idea of obstetric anaesthesia, on exactly these grounds, preaching against it from the pulpit in some parishes as an act of arrogance toward divine will. The medical profession, still cautious after a young patient had already died from careless chloroform administration, during an unrelated dental procedure, an early tragedy that hung over the entire early history of anaesthesia, had its own separate reasons to move slowly as well, quite apart from any theological objection. Then, in 1853, Queen Victoria settled the argument almost by accident, simply by doing what she wanted. Pregnant with her 8th child and already an experienced mother who had endured 7 previous deliveries, without any relief at all, Victoria asked for chloroform, plainly apparently unbothered by whatever theological rumbling was happening among clergy, who had no say whatsoever over what happened in her own bedroom, and her physician, a man named John Snow, administered it during the birth of her son, Prince Leopold. If that name sounds familiar to anyone with an interest in medical history, you are not imagining things. This is the exact same John Snow who within the following year would trace a devastating cholera outbreak in London back to a single contaminated water pump, effectively founding the entire modern field of epidemiology. It is a strange, small delight of history that one man managed to make 2 completely separate foundational contributions to public health. Within roughly 12 months of each other, one of them delivered quite literally at the Queen's own bedside. Victoria's response to the chloroform was by her own account overwhelmingly positive, and she requested it again 4 years later for the birth of her daughter Beatrice. Once word spread that the reigning monarch had personally used and clearly approved of a technique the Church had been quietly discouraging, the theological objections mostly evaporated within a matter of years. Physicians of the era, only half joking, began referring to the practice as anaesthesia, in the manner of the Queen, a phrase that stuck around in medical circles for decades afterward. Even Emma Darwin, wife of the naturalist Charles Darwin, received chloroform for a later birth, administered according to family accounts by her own husband, curious scientist that he apparently remained even in his own bedroom. I want you to notice what actually happened here because it is worth marking clearly against everything else we have covered tonight. For every single story before this one, the goal was survival, keeping a mother and her child alive through danger that could not always be predicted or prevented. This is the first real turning point in this whole history, where the explicit goal became something different: comfort, the deliberate medically sanctioned elimination of suffering that was not actually life-threatening at all. That is not a small shift. It is arguably one of the biggest philosophical changes in this entire story, the moment childbirth stopped being purely a battle against death, and started, at least for those who could access it, becoming something people were allowed to simply want to feel better through without needing to justify that wish with a medical emergency first. Would you have taken the chloroform yourself, knowing what Victoria's own doctors knew at the time, which is to say, not terribly much about the exact mechanism, only that it worked, and that the risks, while real, seemed considerably smaller than the pain it eliminated? I suspect most of us would have said yes without hesitating particularly long, and I do not think that reflects poorly on anyone. Wanting less pain is about as human an instinct as exists. That same instinct, roughly half a century later, would be exploited in a rather different, considerably darker direction. And this next part of the story is one I think deserves to be told honestly rather than romantically, because the popular version of it often leaves out exactly how badly it went. In 1906, two German physicians working in Freiburg, Bernhard Kronig and Karl Gauss, refined an approach, first explored a few years earlier by a colleague combining two drugs, morphine to blunt the physical pain, and scopolamine, a substance drawn from a plant in the nightshade family, to erase the mother's memory of the experience entirely. They called it Dämmerschlaf, meaning twilight sleep, and the promise attached to it was extraordinary. A labourer woman would not actually remember afterward awakening to a healthy baby with no recollection of pain, fear or struggle at all standing between the two moments. It sounded to exhausted, frightened women who had perhaps already survived one difficult delivery and dreaded facing another almost too good to be real, and in a rather important sense it was. Wealthy women began travelling specifically to Freiburg to receive it, and word crossed the ocean quickly. In 1914, two American writers published an enthusiastic article in a widely read magazine describing their own experiences with the method in Germany, and the idea caught fire almost immediately here as well, arriving at a moment when the American women's suffrage movement was already building serious momentum toward the constitutional amendment that would finally grant women the vote a few years later. A formal association sprang up specifically to campaign for wider access to twilight sleep, framing it explicitly as a matter of women's rights, arguing that access to a painless birth was every bit as much a matter of bodily autonomy as the right to vote itself. A truly compelling argument on its own terms, whatever the science underneath it eventually turned out to be worth. One particularly enthusiastic advocate reportedly toured the country, giving speeches with her own infant in tow, presented proudly to audiences as living proof of the method's success, a small sleeping symbol of a cause that felt to the women rallying behind it, like the next logical front in their broader fight for control over their own lives. Here is where the story turns, and I want to walk through this part carefully, because it is truly difficult material. Twilight sleep did not actually eliminate pain. What it eliminated was memory of the pain, which turns out to be a considerably different and considerably more dangerous thing entirely. A woman under its effects remained conscious enough to feel every contraction, to cry out, to struggle against whatever was happening to her body, while the scopolamine simultaneously stripped away her ability to form any lasting memory of doing so. Women under its effects frequently became disoriented, sometimes violently, so thrashing, crying out, occasionally injuring themselves against the furniture around them without any conscious awareness afterward of what their own bodies had done in the meantime. Hospitals adapted by developing specialized padded enclosures to contain patients safely during labor, cushioned cots designed specifically to prevent a thrashing woman from falling or striking anything solid, and by using soft restraints at the wrists to prevent her from harming herself further. While under the drug's effects, a woman fully capable of screaming and struggling for hours, yet retaining no memory whatsoever of having done either one once she finally woke up on the other side of it. The babies paid a price too. Both drugs crossed directly into the child's bloodstream before birth, and infants delivered under twilight sleep were frequently born sedated, sluggish, sometimes requiring active resuscitation, simply to begin breathing properly on their own, arriving into the world drowsy from a chemical cocktail they never consented to and could not process nearly as efficiently as an adult body could. Clinical trials conducted during this same period, when researchers finally bothered running them properly, rather than simply riding the wave of enthusiastic word of mouth, found the method offered no measurable medical advantage over other approaches, despite the considerable risk involved on both sides of the delivery. And yet, driven by demand rather than evidence, twilight sleep became so thoroughly standard practice in American hospitals by the late 1930s that a woman requesting an unmedicated birth in a hospital setting could struggle to find a physician willing to accommodate her, the supposedly liberating choice having quietly hardened within barely a generation into something closer to an unspoken expectation. Is it not a rather bitter irony that a method promoted quite sincerely as an instrument of female liberation ended up producing one of the least autonomous birth experiences in this entire history? Women physically present for their own labor, while functionally absent from any memory or control of it at all. I do not think the women campaigning for twilight sleep were being naive or foolish. I think they wanted entirely reasonably exactly what Victoria's own doctors had offered her decades earlier: relief from suffering that did not have to be endured, and the right to choose that relief for themselves, rather than have it withheld by cautious men who had never once faced the ordeal in question. The tragedy is that the science backing this particular version of that promise was simply not ready yet, rushed into wide use on the strength of enthusiasm and magazine articles, rather than careful patient testing sold as freedom when it was in practice, a different and considerably more literal kind of restraint altogether. It would eventually take working nurses and physicians who had actually witnessed what happened behind those padded doors to start speaking up honestly about what the method actually looked like in practice, slowly chipping away at its reputation until an entirely different philosophy of childbirth care, one built around staying awake and present, rather than erasing the entire event from memory, began building momentum in response. But by then, twilight sleep had already done something that outlasted the method itself considerably, something with consequences reaching far beyond one particular drug combination falling out of favor. It had moved an enormous share of American births permanently out of the home and into the hospital, because managing a drug-disoriented patient safely required exactly the kind of padded rooms, trained staff and constant supervision no ordinary bedroom could reasonably provide, and once that many hospital maternity wards had been built, staffed, and filled, they had no intention of quietly emptying back out again. That particular shift, quiet, gradual, and largely irreversible once it had properly taken hold, is where we are headed next into the final decisive stretch of this entire journey, the moment birth left the home for good, and an entire profession of women who had carried this work for thousands of years found themselves fighting simply to be allowed to keep doing it at all. The man who did more than almost anyone else to finish moving birth out of the home entirely was a respected Chicago obstetrician named Joseph DeLee, and I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further into his story. Of everyone we've discussed tonight, he might be the hardest for me to talk about with any warmth at all, because unlike the Chamberlains hoarding their secret for money, or a frightened royal physician making an impossible call under pressure, DeLee truly believed he was saving women. He simply happened to be spectacularly measurably wrong about how to do it. In 1915, addressing a room full of his fellow physicians at a major medical conference, DeLee argued that childbirth was not in any meaningful sense a normal biological function at all. He compared an ordinary vaginal delivery to a farming accident, suggesting that if a man fell onto a pitchfork and drove the handle through his own body, nobody would hesitate to call that a medical injury requiring urgent treatment. So why, he asked his audience directly, should a baby being pushed through a woman's body be considered any different, simply because it happened to be common and expected rather than accidental? He reportedly wondered aloud whether nature had simply intended women to be used up by reproduction, the way a salmon is used up by the effort of spawning, discarded once its biological purpose was complete, exhausted past the point of real recovery by the very act of bringing new life into existence. Birth in his framework was not something a woman's body was built to survive on its own. It was something a surgeon needed to actively rescue her from every single time, whether or not anything had actually gone wrong in that particular case. That belief led him to design an entire standardized procedure meant to be applied to essentially every delivery, complicated or not. A sedative given early in labor, ether administered as the second stage began, a surgical cut to widen the opening, forceps used routinely to pull the baby through rather than reserved for cases where labor had truly stalled, a drug to help the uterus contract afterward. He called this his prophylactic operation intervention, applied in advance as pure precaution to women who in many cases would have delivered perfectly well without any of it. And he was entirely candid about the professional benefit this offered his own field as well, arguing openly that obstetrics needed to become dignified, respected work, capable of commanding real fees rather than the modest menial rates midwives had traditionally charged for the exact same outcome. Here is the part of this story that I think deserves real attention, because it rarely gets mentioned alongside DeLee's confident rhetoric. Years later, a 1933 report compiled for the White House looked back honestly at what all of this intervention had actually accomplished. Maternal mortality in the United States had not meaningfully improved between 1915 and 1930, despite hospital births climbing sharply during exactly that window, despite prenatal care becoming considerably more widespread, despite aseptic technique finally being taken seriously across most major hospitals. Worse deaths of newborns from injuries sustained during birth itself had actually increased by somewhere between 40 and 50% over that same period, almost certainly connected to the routine, often unnecessary use of forceps. DeLee had spent 2 decades championing on women who in a great many cases would have delivered perfectly safely without any of it. The great precautionary system sold with such total confidence had not clearly saved the lives it promised to save and had very possibly cost some it never needed to touch at all. Does that pattern feel at all familiar to you by this point in the night? A confident man, a persuasive theory, genuine conviction and outcomes that quietly failed to match the promise, while the institutions built around that promise kept right on expanding anyway. We've now watched some version of this exact shape play out with astonishing regularity across nearly every century in this story. The legal and political landscape shifted alongside Delee's influence too, and in an interesting twist, it was largely women themselves who pushed the next major piece of legislation into existence. In 1921, only a year after American women finally won the right to vote, Congress passed the Shepard-Towner Act, introduced in part by Jeannette Rankin, the very first woman ever elected to serve in Congress herself, backed by a wave of newly enfranchised women determined to prove exactly what that vote could accomplish. The Act funded prenatal clinics, nurse, home visits, and public health education across the country, and by most honest measures it worked infant mortality, declining measurably in the states that used it well, thousands of clinics opening their doors for the very first time in communities that had never had access to formal maternal care before. It also, as a secondary effect, imposed new training and licensing standards on midwives nationwide, standards that, as we already spent real time with tonight, fell hardest on the traditional midwives least equipped to meet paperwork requirements that had little to do with their actual skill in the room. The American Medical Association fought the Act aggressively for its entire existence, framing federally funded maternal health care as a dangerous step towards socialized medicine, and in 1929, facing that sustained pressure alongside a newly hostile political climate, Congress simply declined to renew its funding, and the whole program quietly closed its doors after less than a decade of operation. By the middle of the 20th century, the numbers had essentially flipped from where this entire story began, where nearly every baby in this country had once been born at home, surrounded by family and firelight. The overwhelming majority now arrived inside a hospital under fluorescent lights, surrounded by trained staff and standardized procedure, delivered by a profession that had spent 3 centuries fighting, arguing and legislating its way into a room women had once controlled entirely on their own. Home birth, once simply how things were done, had become within a couple of generations the unusual exception, requiring explanation, rather than the ordinary rule requiring none. I think it would be dishonest and frankly a little lazy to end this story pretending the hospital brought nothing but loss. That would flatten everything we have spent this entire night exploring into something far simpler than the truth actually is. Blood transfusions save mothers who would have bled to death in any bedroom in any century before this one. Safe surgical delivery saves babies who would never have survived an obstructed labour. No birthing stool or steady pair of hands could have resolved no matter how many generations of skill stood behind those hands. Antiseptic technique, however bitterly and slowly it was accepted, truly ended the era of childbed fever, tearing through maternity wards unchecked. These are not small things, and none of the women we met earlier tonight, Martha Ballard included, would have turned modern surgery away if it had been available to her on one of her hardest nights out on the ice, miles from anyone who could help her. But something real was lost in this same transition too, and I do not think it does anyone any favours to pretend otherwise simply because the story has a truly happy medical ending attached to it. An entire ancient network of women teaching women adapting knowledge, household by household, generation by generation, largely disappeared within the span of a single human lifetime, taking with it centuries of accumulated hard-won observation that no textbook ever fully captured before it vanished. The room stopped belonging primarily to the person doing the hardest work inside it, and increasingly belonged instead to whoever was standing, credentialed at the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand, following a protocol written by someone who had never once experienced labour themselves. The story does not simply end there though, and this final piece feels important to leave you with tonight. Beginning in the 1970s alongside a broader wave of feminist thinking about bodily autonomy, a genuine counter-movement took shape women, and increasingly a number of physicians as well, questioning whether quite so much routine intervention had ever actually been necessary in the first place. Home birth saw a real measurable resurgence championed by mothers who had grown tired of feeling like a passive patient in the most significant physical event of their own lives. Midwifery itself was formally rebuilt as a licensed, respected medical profession, rather than an informal inherited skill, blending centuries of traditional wisdom with genuine modern training rather than discarding one for the other, though it is worth noting honestly that this particular revival did not always extend the same welcome backward to the black midwives, whose entire tradition had been dismantled just a few decades earlier. An entirely new role emerged during exactly this period. 2, the doula, a word borrowed from ancient Greek meaning roughly a woman who serves, reintroduced into English specifically to describe a trained companion whose entire job is simply to stay beside a labouring woman, offering steady comfort and continuous presence through the hardest hours, which is, if you think about it honestly, almost precisely the role the gossips gathered around a medieval bed or the women encircling a birthing stool in ancient Egypt had been quietly filling the entire time under an older name nobody had bothered reviving until then. So let's go back for just a moment to exactly where we began tonight. A room lit only by flame. Steam curling from a pot kept boiling since midday. A low wooden stool, its seat worn smooth by hips and hands, that came long before this particular night. A circle of women who trusted each other completely, working without a hospital, without a doctor, without anything at all beyond memory courage, and each other listening for that first small furious cry that told them finally that the night had ended the way they had all been hoping it would. We have travelled an extraordinary distance since that opening image through Egypt and Rome, through chalk circles drawn against demons, and a church door that stayed closed for 40 days, through a family hiding a life-saving secret under their own floorboards, for 100 years, through a Maine winter crossed on foot over river ice, and a Georgia dirt road walked by a woman named Mary, through a Vienna hospital ward that refused to believe its own doctor's hands could kill, through a queen who quietly defied her own church, and a movement that promised freedom and delivered restraints instead. And somehow, threaded through every single one of those centuries, the same basic truth kept surfacing again and again in slightly different clothing. Women have always known far more about their own bodies than the people in power gave them credit for, and progress. Real progress tends to happen fastest in exactly the moment someone finally stops to listen properly. If you take only one thing with you from everything we have covered together tonight, I hope it is this. Nearly every person who has ever lived arrived into this world because a woman, often entirely unnamed, entirely unpaid, and entirely unrecognized by whatever official record her century happened to be keeping, showed up anyway in the worst weather in the middle of the night for a stranger or a neighbour or a queen, and simply did the work. She did it without a diploma hanging on her wall, without a fee that reflected what her skill was actually worth, and very often without anyone ever once thinking to write her name down anywhere at all. History has a long, frustrating habit of remembering the men who eventually wrote the theories down, while quietly forgetting the women who had already been living the practice for thousands of years beforehand, refining it, passing it hand to hand, getting it right, far more often than the record has ever properly given them credit for. I hope tonight went at least some small way toward correcting that, even if only inside your own head for one quiet evening before you drift off to sleep. Thank you truly for spending this time with me tonight. all the way to the very end, staying with a story this long, this late, while the rest of the world outside your window has probably long since gone quiet, is its own small act of trust, and I never take that lightly. If any part of this journey settled your mind or taught you something you did not expect to learn right before falling asleep, it would mean a great deal to me if you left a like on your way out, and if you have not already done so, consider staying close by subscribing, so the next story finds you just as easily as this one did. Tell me if you like in the comments, which part of tonight surprised you the most? The goddess with the body of a hippopotamus, the secret hidden under a floorboard for 100 years, or the ordinary woman in Maine who quietly outperformed an entire era's odds? I read every one of them, and I love knowing which corner of this history landed the hardest with you. I have more evenings like this one waiting to be told, and I would truly love the company. Rest well tonight, whoever and wherever you are, and I will see you again soon for the next story.